There are moments in the grim darkness of the far future where a single warrior stands between extinction and survival, where one soldier, bearing the weight of past failures and future hopes, becomes the bulwark against a tide of destruction that threatens to consume everything humanity has built. This is the story of such a moment, and such a warrior. His name is Demetrian Titus, once disgraced, once broken, once cast into the shadows of exile and penance, but now he stands as Master of the Watch, Captain of the Ultramarine Second Company, and the last best hope for the 500 worlds of Ultramar as an ancient evil, rises from the stars to claim what was once theirs. This is not just a story about one Space Marine. This is the story of redemption earned through blood and fire. It's the story of an empire within an empire, a realm of 500 worlds that represents the brightest jewel in the Imperium's crown, and it's the story of a threat so ancient, so terrifying, that even the soulless Necrons themselves whisper its name in fear. Welcome to the tale of Captain Titus's last stand against Nekrosor Ammentar and the corrupted legions of the Destroyer Curse. Welcome to the Vespator Front, where the fate of Ultramar hangs in the balance. Welcome to the defence of the 500 worlds. The Imperium of Man sprawls across 1,000,000 worlds, each one a flickering candle in the endless dark of the galaxy. But among these countless stars, some shine brighter than others. Some regions stand as beacons of what humanity could be, what it once was, and what it fights every day to remain. The realm of Ultramar is one such beacon. For 10,000 years it has endured as a testament to order, progress, and the vision of one of the Emperor's greatest sons, but even the brightest lights cast the deepest shadows, and in those shadows something ancient is stirring, something that remembers when the galaxy was young, when the stars themselves were its playthings, and when life was nothing more than an infestation to be eradicated. The Necrons are rising, and at their head marches a figure from myth and nightmare both, Nekrosor Ammentar, the architect of the Destroyer Curse, seeking to reunite the shattered fragments of the Nightbringer, the stand god of death itself. Standing against this tide of mechanical horror is Captain Demetrian Titus, a warrior whose journey from disgrace to redemption mirrors the very struggle of the Imperium itself, a man who has faced down orcs, tyrannids, and the forces of chaos, a soldier who has been broken and reforged, tested and tempered in fires that would have destroyed lesser men, and now, with the Primarch Roboute Guilliman leading the Indomitus Crusade across the galaxy, Titus has been entrusted with perhaps the most crucial mission of all, defending the heart of Ultramar while its greatest champion fights wars on 1,000 distant fronts. This is a war that will test everything Titus has learned, everything he has become. The Vespator Front stretches across the eastern reaches of Ultramar, a region of critical strategic importance, where Imperial forces must hold the line against an enemy that cannot be reasoned with, cannot be intimidated, and will not stop until every last spark of life has been extinguished from the galaxy. It's a campaign that will see him commanding not just Space Marines, but mortal soldiers, fleet commanders, diplomats, and even psychers, all united under his banner as the Wardens of Ultramar. The stakes could not be higher. If Ultramar falls, if the 500 worlds are consumed by the Necron advance, then the entire eastern flank of the Imperium collapses. Billions will die. Trillions more will be left without hope, without protection, easy prey for every predator that stalks the void. The loss would be incalculable, a wound from which the Imperium might never recover. But Titus is not alone. Around him stands a brotherhood of warriors, each one tested in the crucible of war. Ancient Gadriel, who once doubted him but now carries the banner of the Second Company into battle at his side. Veteran Sergeant Matarus, the man who first saw potential in a young boy from Tarentus and brought him into the chapter. Fleet Commander Gaius Silva, coordinating the naval battles that rage above the embattled worlds. Amelia Minervas of the Ultramar Defense Auxilia, the voice of the mortal soldiers who fight and die alongside the angels of death. Lucia Vesta, whose diplomatic skills have prevented more wars than her warriors have fought, and Dynal Cornelius, an astropath whose age surpasses that of most hive cities, ensuring that commands reach the front lines even as the warp storms rage. Together they are the Wardens of Ultramar. Together they will face the rising storm. Together they will write their names into legend or die in the attempt. But to understand how we arrived at this moment, to truly grasp what's at stake on the Vespator Front, we must first understand the man at its centre. We must journey back to the beginning, to a simple agricultural world where a boy named Demetrian took his first steps on a path that would lead him through glory and shame, through exile and redemption, to this final, desperate stand. Every legend begins somewhere. For Demetrian Titus, that somewhere was the agri-world of Tarentus, a planet of golden grain fields and honest labour, nestled in the realm of Ultramar approximately 80 years before Hive Fleet Behemoth would tear through the region like a scythe through wheat. It was a world far removed from the grand battlefields and towering fortress monasteries where space marines are made, a place where hard work and simple virtues were the measure of a person's worth. Titus was born to a humble family, not nobility, not warriors, just people of modest means who worked the land and lived quiet lives under the benevolent administration of the Ultramarines. In another time, in another place, young, Demetrian might have lived his entire life on that world, perhaps becoming a farm supervisor or a local administrator. He might have married, raised children, grown old watching the grain grow tall under Tarentus' sun, and been buried in its rich soil when his time came. But fate, or the Emperor, or perhaps simply the keen eye of an experienced recruiter, had other plans. The Ultramarines, unlike many Space Marine chapters, do not recruit solely through combat trials or ritual hunts. While martial prowess is certainly valued, the sons of Guilliman look for something more in their prospective recruits. They seek intelligence, adaptability, leadership potential, and perhaps most importantly the capacity to understand not just how to win wars, but why wars must be fought and what must be preserved in their aftermath. They look for boys who can become not just warriors, but statesmen, administrators, and guardians of the civilization they protect. One day, a selector named Matorus arrived on Tarentus. Veteran Sergeant Matorus was a decorated warrior of the chapter, his armour bearing the marks of campaigns that stretched back longer than most mortals lived. His task was to observe the youth of the planet, to separate the wheat from the chaff, to identify those rare individuals who possessed the potential to transcend their mortal limitations and become angels of death. And in young Demetrian he found something remarkable. The exact circumstances of their first meeting have become the stuff of chapter legend, details embellished and refined through countless retellings around campfires and in training halls. What we know for certain is that Matorus discovered the boy on a battlefield of some kind, clutching an Astartes combat knife. Whether this was the aftermath of a minor Xenos incursion, a training exercise gone awry, or some other crisis is lost to time, what matters is what Matorus saw in that moment. The veteran looked into the boy's eyes and saw something that made him stop, made him take notice. He later reported in his formal recommendation to the chapter that the child had never known fear, not the reckless bravado of youth, not the ignorance of one who has never faced real danger, but a deep fundamental absence of the paralysing terror that grips most mortals when they face death. In its place was something else: determination, resolve, and an instinctive understanding that some things are worth dying for. That quality, that core of adamantium running through the boy's soul marked him as Ultramarines material. Matorus made his recommendation. The chapter's apothecaries confirmed that young Demetrian possessed the physical and genetic compatibility necessary for the transformation, and the boy's life changed forever. For those not intimately familiar with the process of creating a Space Marine, let me paint the picture. It is not a gentle thing. It is not quick. The transformation from mortal child to transhuman warrior is, a crucible that kills more aspirants than it saves. The human body was not designed to accept 19 additional organs, each one a miracle of bioengineering, each one pushing the limits of what flesh and bone can endure. The muscles must be restructured, the skeleton reinforced, the nervous system rewired to process information at superhuman speeds. And beyond the physical changes come the mental conditioning, the hypno-indoctrination, the endless drills and training that burn away the individual and forge something new. Many aspirants break under the strain, their bodies rejecting the implants, their minds unable to cope with the transformation. They die screaming on the operating tables, or they emerge as hollow shells, the spark that made them human snuffed out by the process that should have elevated them. But Titus thrived. From his earliest days as a scout in the 10th Company, he excelled at every trial set before him. Whether it was long-range reconnaissance missions into hostile territory, close-quarters combat drills against veteran instructors, or the complex strategic exercises that tested his ability to think 3 moves ahead of his opponents, young Titus demonstrated an aptitude that set him apart from his cohort. He absorbed the lessons of the Codex Astartes, that massive tome of military doctrine penned by Primarch Roboute Guilliman himself, with a fervour that impressed even his most demanding instructors. But more than that, he understood something that many Space Marines, for all their superhuman capabilities, sometimes forget. The Codex is a guide, not a prison. It contains the accumulated wisdom of 10,000 years of warfare, but it was never meant to be followed blindly. Guilliman himself wrote in its introduction that the greatest warriors are those who can adapt its principles to unexpected circumstances, who can see the spirit behind the letter and act accordingly. This understanding would later get Titus into trouble, would mark him as unorthodox in the eyes of more rigid brothers like Leandros. But in his early years it simply marked him as a Marine with exceptional potential. He wasn't just following orders, he was understanding them, internalising the reasoning behind them, and preparing himself for the day when he would need to give orders of his own. The years passed. Titus progressed through the ranks of the Scout Company, earning his power armour and his place among the battle brothers of the chapter proper. He served in the Devastator squads, learning to deliver overwhelming firepower where it was needed most. He advanced to the assault squads, mastering the jump pack and the deadly art of close-quarters combat. Finally, he found his place among the tactical squads, the backbone of any Space Marine force, where his tactical flexibility and strategic thinking could shine. By the time Titus reached his 50th year of service, still relatively young by Astarte standards, he had already earned decorations and commendations that some veterans twice his age had yet to achieve. He had faced orcs in the jungles of Vortan IV, purging a rising war before it could gather enough momentum to threaten nearby systems. He had fought Eldar raiders on the edges of Ultramar, learning to respect the ancient Xenos' speed and cunning, even as he brought them low. He had stood in the firing line against traitor rebels who had fallen to chaos worship, cleansing their corruption with bolter fire and blade. But nothing could have prepared him for what was coming. Because in the year 745 of the 41st millennium, the Fourth Tyrannic War had arrived. And though Titus didn't know it yet, his entire life, every trial and triumph, had been preparation for the battles that would define his legend. The First Tyrannic War changed everything. For the Ultramarines, for Ultramar, and for Demetrian Titus, it marked a watershed moment that would shape the course of his entire career. When the bioships of Hive Fleet Behemoth descended from the void like a swarm of locusts with a galaxy's hunger, they brought with them a horror unlike anything the Imperium had faced in generations. The Tyranids are not like other enemies. They cannot be negotiated with, bribed, or intimidated. They have no culture to exploit, no internal divisions to manipulate, no strategic objectives beyond the simple, terrible imperative to consume all biomass in their path. Fighting them is like fighting a force of nature, except this force of nature has teeth and claws and acid and enough biological diversity to adapt to any defense you can mount. When the distress calls began emanating from Ultramar, every Ultramarine who could reach the realm raced home. But as fate would have it, Titus and the Second Company were far from Macragge when Hive Fleet Behemoth struck. They were prosecuting a campaign on the far side of the Segmentum Ultima, dealing with an orc incursion that had threatened a vital Forge world. By the time the astropathic distress calls fought their way through the shadow in the warp, that psychic disruption the Tyranids bring with them like a shroud, and reached the Second Company, the battle for Macragge was already decided. The Ultramarines had won, but at a terrible cost. The First Company, those vaunted veterans in Terminator armour who represented the chapter's elite, had been virtually annihilated. Chapter Master Marneus Calga himself had been gravely wounded, his body rebuilt with extensive bionics in the aftermath. Hundreds of battle brothers lay dead or so badly wounded they would never fight again. The chapter had been gutted, its strength reduced to a shadow of what it had been, and for Titus, who had been far away when his chapter needed him most, there was only the bitter taste of guilt and the determination to ensure he would never miss such a call again. He threw himself into the purge operations that followed, the long, grinding campaign to scour every last Tyranid organism from Ultramar's worlds. It was brutal, exhausting work. The Hive Fleet had seeded countless worlds with Genestealers and other bioforms that would lurk in the shadows, breeding and growing, waiting to rise again when the time was right. This was where Titus began to develop the trait that would define his approach to warfare for the rest of his career: close-quarter study of Xenos tactics. While other commanders were content to analyse after-action reports and strategic data, Titus wanted to understand his enemies on a fundamental level. He led kill teams deep into Tyranid-infested zones, observing how the creatures communicated, how they coordinated, how they adapted to different threats. He studied their behaviour patterns, their hunting strategies, their weaknesses. It was dangerous work. More than once, his obsessive need to understand the enemy nearly got him killed. But the knowledge he gained was invaluable. He learned to predict Tyranid movements before they happened, to identify the behavioural signatures that indicated a Tyranid warrior was about to spring an ambush, to spot the subtle cues that revealed the location of underground Genestealer lairs. His reports became required reading for officers throughout the chapter, and his reputation as a Xenos expert began to spread. During this period, Titus served under Captain Lucian Trajan, the commander of the Second Company. Trajan was the very model of what an Ultramarine should be: tactically brilliant, personally courageous, utterly committed to the defence of the Imperium, and possessed of an almost paternal concern for the warriors under his command. He had been promoted to captain after the previous commander, Severus Agamemnon, had been elevated to lead the First Company in the wake of their devastating losses at Macragge. Trajan recognised Titus's potential immediately and selected him to serve as a sergeant in his command squad, putting the younger Marine in a position to observe command decisions firsthand and to contribute his unique insights to the company's operations. It was an honour and a responsibility, and Titus embraced it with characteristic intensity. He studied everything Trajan did, absorbing lessons in leadership, logistics, and the art of waging war on a company scale. For nearly a century, Titus served under Trajan. They fought together across dozens of war zones, from burning hive cities to frozen death worlds, from void battles aboard space hulks to planetary defence operations against overwhelming odds. They faced orcs and Eldar, chaos renegades and dark Eldar raiders, traitor guard regiments and mutant uprisings. With each campaign, Titus's skills sharpened, his experience deepened, and his understanding of war grew more sophisticated. Captain Trajan and First Captain Guilliman both took a personal interest in Titus's development, seeing in him the raw material for future command. They pushed him, tested him, gave him increasingly complex assignments and watched to see how he would respond. Time and again, Titus exceeded their expectations. He demonstrated not just tactical acumen but strategic vision, not just the ability to win battles but the wisdom to consider what came after the shooting stopped. But all good things must end, and the brutal reality of war in the 41st millennium is that even the greatest warriors can fall to an unlucky shot or an unexpected ambush. The Battle of Beta Arcturus would prove to be the defining moment, the hinge upon which Titus's entire career would turn. Beta Arcturus was an imperial world besieged by the Assyriani forces of craft-world Biltan. The Eldar had come for reasons of their own, following threads of fate and prophecy that only they understood, seeking to claim or destroy something on that world that threatened their ancient plans. The Ultramarines' second company responded to the distress call, arriving aboard the Righteous Fury. The company's often used strike cruiser that had seen them through countless campaigns. Captain Trajan deployed with overwhelming force, bringing half the company down to Beta Arcturus' surface in a lightning strike aimed at the Eldar Autarch, the commander of the Xenos forces. The plan was classic Ultramarines doctrine: decapitate the enemy leadership, shatter their command structure, and exploit the resulting confusion to force a rout. Titus led his command squad in support of Trajan, cutting through aspect warriors with brutal efficiency as they drove toward their objective. The plan worked. Trajan engaged the Autarch in single combat, a duel of titans that ranged across the battlefield while the command squad held off wave after wave of aspect warriors trying to reach their commander. When Trajan's power fist finally connected with the Autarch's helmet, crushing it and the alien within, the battle should have been over. The Eldar, deprived of their central directing intelligence, should have withdrawn, and they did, but not before laying one final trap. Even as their forces began to fade back to their webway portals, the Eldar had captured a young Ultramarine named Leandros, a promising scout who had been conducting reconnaissance during the battle. When Captain Trajan learned of this, he made a decision that would haunt Titus for decades to come. He gave command of the second company to Titus and took a combat squad to rescue Leandros. It was a trap, of course. The Biltan forces had set the perfect ambush, using the captured marine as bait to lure Trajan into a killing ground where they could strike from every angle at once. Despite his skill, despite his experience, despite everything he knew about fighting Eldar, Trajan was overwhelmed. He and his combat squad fought with the fury that only Space Marines can bring to bear, but in the end, shuriken catapults and power weapons found their marks. Captain Lucian Trajan, one of the finest officers the Ultramarines had ever produced, died on the blood-stained soil of Beta Arcturus. His gene seed later recovered, but his loss keenly felt throughout the chapter. When Titus learned of his captain's death, something broke inside him. Grief turned to fury, and fury to determination. He rallied the second company with a roar that could be heard across the Voxnet, coordinating a counterattack that drove the remaining Eldar forces completely off the planet. The Xenos withdrew through their webway portals, and both Leandros and Captain Trajan's body were recovered from the battlefield. The victory was complete, but hollow. Titus had won, but the cost was incalculable. He had lost not just his captain, but his mentor, the man who had shaped his understanding of command and prepared him for leadership. On the voyage back to Macragge, Titus found himself grappling with questions he had never had to face before. How do you lead when you know your decisions might send good men to their deaths? How do you balance the mission against the lives of your subordinates? How do you live with the weight of command? When the second company returned to Macragge, the chapter's leadership faced a decision. Who would be the new captain of the second? Tradition and merit pointed clearly to one answer: Demetrian Titus. He had proven his tactical brilliance, his courage, and his ability to inspire and lead warriors in the most desperate circumstances. He had trained under some of the chapter's finest officers, absorbed their lessons, and demonstrated that he could apply them in the heat of battle. Chapter Master Marneus Calgar himself made the appointment, presenting Titus with the captain's laurels in a ceremony attended by the entire chapter. It was a moment of triumph, the culmination of over a century of dedicated service. Demetrian Titus, the boy from Tarentus who had never known fear, was now captain of the Second Company, one of the Ultramarines' most prestigious commands. He inherited Trajan's command squad, including the young Leandros whose rescue had cost his predecessor his life. He inherited the righteous fury and all the responsibilities that came with leading one of the Imperium's finest fighting units. And he inherited the expectations that came with wearing the white helmet of an Ultramarines captain. The expectation that he would be not just a warrior but a statesman, not just a commander but a guardian of the civilization they fought to protect. In his first address to the company, Titus spoke of Captain Trajan, honouring the fallen hero and pledging to live up to the example he had set. He spoke of the Codex Astartes and the wisdom of the Primarch, but also of the need to adapt, to think, to consider each situation on its own merits rather than simply applying rote solutions. He spoke of the enemy, of the need to understand those they fought so that they could better destroy them. And he spoke of brotherhood, of the bonds that tied one Marine to another and that made the Second Company not just a military unit, but a family. His words resonated with the veterans who had served under Trajan and gave hope to the newer warriors who looked to their captain for guidance. The Second Company had a new leader, and he was determined to honour the trust that had been placed in him. For a time, all was well. For a time, Captain Demetrian Titus stood as a shining example of everything the Ultramarines aspired to be, but shadows were gathering. Events were already in motion that would test not just Titus's skill as a warrior, but his very soul. The forge world of Graia was about to come under attack, and when Titus answered that call, he would begin a journey that would lead him through shame, exile, redemption, and ultimately to the command of the defence of Ultramar itself. The distress call from Graia arrived during what should have been a routine patrol sweep through the Segmentum Tempestus. The Forge world, a critical industrial centre of the Adeptus Mechanicus, was under assault by a massive orc wag. Warboss Grimskull, a particularly brutal and cunning greenskin, had gathered a horde of unprecedented size and set his sights on Graia's considerable manufacturing capabilities. If the orcs secured the Forge world, they would gain access to weapons production that could fuel invasions across an entire sector. But Graia's value went beyond its ordinary manufactoria. The world was home to secret projects, classified weapons research, and perhaps most importantly several Warlord-class Titans, towering war machines that represented some of the most powerful weapons in the Imperium's arsenal. If those Titans fell into Orc hands, or if they were destroyed defending the world, the loss would be catastrophic. Captain Titus received the distress call and made an immediate decision. The Second Company would respond. This was precisely the kind of mission the Ultramarines were created for, the kind of critical intervention where a single company of Space Marines could make the difference between victory and defeat, between a world saved and a sector doomed. He ordered the Righteous Fury to make for Graia with all speed, knowing that every hour of delay would cost Imperial lives and give the Orcs more time to entrench. What Captain Titus couldn't know was that his company had already been scattered by warp turbulence during their approach to the system. When his Thunderhawk gunship made its combat drop into Graia's war-torn surface, he found himself accompanied not by the full might of the Second Company, but by just two warriors, veteran Sergeant Sidonus, a grizzled warrior who had served alongside Titus for decades, and a young Marine named Leandros, the same warrior whose rescue had cost Captain Trajan his life years before. 3 Space Marines against an entire Orc war would have been suicide for any other warriors, but these were Ultramarines, and they were determined to hold the line until reinforcements could arrive. The campaign that followed would be spoken of in reverent tones throughout the chapter for years to come, a masterclass in how a small but determined force could achieve objectives far beyond what their numbers suggested. Sidonus was everything a Space Marine should be: loyal, experienced, pragmatic, and possessed of a dry wit that kept spirits high even in the darkest moments. He and Titus had fought together for so long that they could communicate with just a glance, each one knowing instinctively what the other was thinking. His presence was a rock that Titus could lean on, a source of wisdom and perspective when the weight of command threatened to overwhelm. Leandros was Sidonus's opposite in many ways. Young, idealistic and rigid in his adherence to the Codex Astartes, he represented a new generation of Ultramarines who had been trained in the dark years after the First Tyrannic War, when the chapter was rebuilding and doctrine was emphasized over everything else. He was brave, certainly, and skilled enough to have earned his power armor, but he lacked the flexibility, the willingness to adapt that Titus valued so highly. Where Titus saw the Codex as a guide to be interpreted, Leandros saw it as scripture to be followed to the letter. This difference in philosophy would simmer beneath the surface throughout their mission on Graia, occasionally boiling over into arguments about tactics and approach. Titus would improvise, taking calculated risks and trusting his instincts when the Codex didn't provide clear answers for the unique situations they faced. Leandros would protest, citing chapter and verse of the Codex, arguing that deviation from established doctrine was dangerous, that it opened the door to the corruption that had brought down so many warriors before them. But despite these tensions, the three worked together effectively. They fought their way through wave after wave of orcs, from mobs of boys to towering knobs, from killer cans to dreadnoughts cobbled together from scrap metal and sheer orky ingenuity. They coordinated with the local PDF forces and the representatives of the Adeptus Mechanicus, particularly Second Lieutenant Mira of the Imperial Guard, a courageous officer who earned Titus's respect through her determination to defend her world against impossible odds. The mission grew more complex when they discovered that Graia housed something called the Power Source, a mysterious artifact of unknown origin that Warboss Grimskull seemed particularly interested in acquiring. The Mechanicus was characteristically secretive about the device's true nature and purpose, but it quickly became clear that this was no ordinary piece of technology. It interacted with the warp in ways that made it potentially dangerous in the wrong hands. As if the Orc invasion wasn't enough, Titus and his team soon discovered a far worse threat: chaos. The forces of chaos had been drawn to Graia by the Power Source, and a Chaos Lord of the Black Legion named Nemeroth had infiltrated the world, working behind the scenes to claim the artifact for his own purposes. This was a nightmare scenario, a three-way battle between Orcs, Chaos and the Imperium, all fighting for control of a Forge world and its mysterious power source. The campaign reached its climax when Nemeroth succeeded in activating the power source, opening a massive warp rift that allowed countless demons to pour through into real space. The sky itself seemed to tear open, bleeding madness and corruption onto the world below. It was a scene from humanity's darkest nightmares, the kind of catastrophe that could doom not just Graia, but every world in the surrounding sector. And it was here, in the midst of this apocalyptic scenario, that something inexplicable happened. Captain Titus, in his determination to stop Nemeroth and close the warp rift, found himself exposed to raw warp energy on a level that should have killed or corrupted him instantly. The Immaterium, that roiling sea of souls and emotions that underlies reality, is inimical to human life. To be touched by it directly, to feel its energies flowing through you, is to invite madness, mutation, and damnation. But Titus endured. He passed through walls of warp energy that vaporized the chaos cultists around him. He withstood direct exposure to demonic influence that should have twisted his flesh and broken his mind. And throughout it all he remained uncorrupted, his will unbroken, his soul intact. He couldn't explain it himself, didn't understand why he seemed to have this resistance to the warp's influence. All he knew was that the Emperor protected, and that he had a mission to complete. He confronted Nemeroth in the heart of the Chaos Lord's ritual, engaging the corrupted warrior in single combat, while the fate of Graia hung in the balance. It was a brutal duel, the kind that would be immortalized in chapter histories if anyone ever learned the full truth of what happened. Nemeroth was ancient, powerful, enhanced by dark gifts from his patrons in the warp. Titus was younger, driven by duty and an iron will that refused to bend. In the end, duty triumphed over corruption. Titus's chainsword found Nemeroth's neck, and the Chaos Lord's head rolled across the platform. With their leader dead and their ritual disrupted, the demonic invasion faltered. The warp rift began to close, reality reasserting itself over the madness that had threatened to consume Graia. The remaining Chaos forces were driven back or destroyed, and the Orcs, deprived of the leadership that Grimskull had provided, broke into infighting and fled. Graia was saved. The Forge world was battered, burned and scarred, but it survived. The Titans were secure, the Manufactoria could be rebuilt, and the Imperium retained this critical industrial centre. By any measure, the mission was a complete success. Captain Titus and his small team had achieved what an entire Guard regiment might not have managed, holding the line against overwhelming odds and turning defeat into victory. But victory came with a terrible price, one that Titus could not have anticipated. In the aftermath of the battle, as Imperial reinforcements finally arrived and began the process of securing the world and dealing with the remaining threats, Inquisitor Thrax of the Order Hereticus arrived to debrief the Space Marines about their encounter with Chaos. It was standard procedure. Any time Imperial forces engaged with the forces of Chaos, the Inquisition wanted detailed reports, wanted to understand what had happened and ensure that no corruption had taken root. Titus expected a few questions, perhaps a cursory examination by Thrax's psychers, and then clearance to return to his chapter and continue his duties. Instead, he was arrested, detained, taken into custody on suspicion of heresy and potential corruption. Because Leandros, the young marine who Titus had led through the crucible of Graia, had filed a private report with Inquisitor Thrax, a report that detailed Titus's unnatural resistance to warp energy, his willingness to deviate from the Codex Astartes, and his general unorthodox approach to warfare. A report that suggested, in carefully diplomatic language, that Captain Titus might be tainted by chaos. It was a betrayal, not in the sense that Leandros was acting out of malice or personal ambition, but in the sense that he had violated the most sacred bond between battle brothers. Space Marines are supposed to handle internal matters internally. If Leandros had concerns about his captain, he should have taken them to the chapter's chaplains, to Chapter Master Calgar, to anyone within the Ultramarines hierarchy. Instead, he had gone to an outside authority, effectively accusing his captain of heresy to the Inquisition. Titus said nothing in his own defence. He stood silent as the Inquisitor's retinue shackled him and prepared to take him away. He could see the shock on Sidonus's face, the confusion and anger warring with the ingrained obedience to Imperial authority. He met Leandros's eyes one last time, and saw there not triumph, but uncertainty, a young warrior beginning to understand the magnitude of what he had done. As Inquisitor Thrax led him away, Titus took one last look at Graia, at the world he had saved, at the two warriors he had fought beside. He had given everything to the Imperium, had proven his loyalty 1,000 times over in 100 battles, and now, at the moment of his greatest triumph, he was being branded a potential traitor, hauled away to face interrogation and judgment by forces he couldn't fight and wouldn't fight even if he could. The bright career of Captain Demetrian Titus, the rising star of the Ultramarine Second Company, had come to a sudden and shocking end. What followed would be years of darkness, of pain, of exile from everything he had known and loved. But those years would also be years of preparation, of tempering, forging him into something harder and more determined than he had been before. Because Captain Titus was not done yet, not by a long shot. His story was far from over. It was simply entering a new chapter, one written in shadows and penance, in service without recognition or reward. He would descend into that darkness believing he might never emerge. And when he finally did, he would be reborn as something more than he had been before. The interrogation chambers of the Inquisition are places where time loses meaning. Days blend into weeks, weeks into months, and for those being questioned, reality itself becomes negotiable. For Demetrian Titus, formerly captain of the Ultramarines' Second Company, those chambers became his entire world for longer than he cared to count. Inquisitor Thrax was thorough, meticulous, and utterly convinced that somewhere beneath Titus's facade of loyalty lurked the taint of chaos. How else to explain his resistance to warp energy? How else to understand his ability to survive exposure that should have killed or corrupted him? In the Inquisition's experience, such immunity came from one of two sources. Either you were a blank, a pariah, someone whose soul actually repelled the warp, or you had made a pact with the dark powers, trading your loyalty for protection. Titus was not a blank. If he had been, it would have been discovered during his transformation into a space marine, during any of the countless battles where he had fought alongside psychers, or been in the presence of sanctioned Imperial telepaths. So if he wasn't a blank, then by the Inquisition's logic he must be corrupted. It was simple, brutal logic, the kind that had condemned countless loyal servants of the Emperor over the centuries. They probed his mind with psychic interrogations that left him gasping and bleeding from ears and nose. They subjected his body to examinations that would have killed a normal human, searching for any sign of mutation, any hint of physical corruption. They reviewed every mission he had ever undertaken, every decision he had made, looking for patterns of behaviour that might indicate hidden allegiances or subtle manipulation by chaos powers. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. Titus was exactly what he appeared to be, a loyal space marine who had fought for the Imperium his entire adult life, who had never once considered betraying his oaths, who would rather die than serve the ruinous powers. His resistance to warp energy remained inexplicable, but inexplicable is not the same as heretical. Sometimes the Emperor protects in ways that mortals cannot understand. Sometimes faith and loyalty are shields that no corruption can pierce. After what might have been years of interrogation and examination, Inquisitor Thrax was finally forced to acknowledge the truth. There was no evidence of corruption. None. Captain Demetrian Titus was, by every test and measure available to the Inquisition, uncorrupted by chaos. He was innocent of the accusations that had been levelled against him. But innocence, in the Imperium of man, is not always enough. The Inquisition does not like to be wrong, and even when forced to admit that someone is not corrupted, they rarely do so without conditions. Thrax declared Titus free of taint, but made it clear that suspicion would always hang over him. He had been exposed to the warp in ways that few loyalists ever experienced. Even if he was clean now, who could say what the future held? The seeds of corruption might be dormant, waiting to bloom years or decades hence. And so, while Titus was released from the Inquisition's custody, he was not returned to his chapter. He was not restored to his rank. Instead, he was given a choice, though it was a choice in name only. Join the Deathwatch, the elite Xenos hunting force that drew warriors from various Space Marine chapters for special operations, or face permanent exile from service stripped of his rank and honours, marked forever as someone who had been questioned but never quite cleared. Titus chose the Deathwatch, because serving in shadow and silence was better than not serving at all, because even in exile from his chapter, he could still fight for the Emperor and the Imperium, and because, deep in his heart, he harboured a hope that perhaps one day, through decades or centuries of faithful service, he might earn his way back to the brothers he had been forced to leave behind. The Deathwatch operates differently from regular Space Marine chapters. Warriors seconded to the organisation surrender their chapter colours, painting their armour black to signify their new allegiance. They serve alongside brothers from many different chapters, each bringing unique skills and perspectives to specialised kill teams designed to eliminate specific Xenos threats. It's an honour to serve in the Deathwatch, a recognition of exceptional skill and dedication. But for Titus, it felt like exile. He went further than most, embracing the anonymity that the Deathwatch offered. He became a Blackshield, a warrior who completely divests himself of his previous identity, who takes on a new name and refuses to speak of his past. These are typically warriors who left their chapters under mysterious or troubled circumstances, who carry secrets or shames they wish to leave behind. They serve with distinction, but always at a distance, never quite part of the brotherhood around them. Titus chose the name Nullus. Nothing. Empty. It was a statement of how he felt. Hollowed out, stripped of identity and purpose beyond the simple imperative to kill Xenos in the Emperor's name. He joined the Deathwatch Watch Fortress on the edge of Imperial space, a massive station that served as the organization's primary base of operations in the sector. There, he was assigned to kill Team Kazarin, a squad of veterans drawn from various chapters. There was Brother Ulfar of the Space Wolves, a fierce warrior whose chapter valued individual initiative and personal prowess over rigid tactical doctrine. There was Brother Kelstros of the Blood Angels, bearing the artistic sensibilities and barely controlled fury that characterized the sons of Sanguinius. Brother Baron of the Black Templars brought the zealous fervour of a chapter that had never accepted the Codex Astarte and waged eternal crusade against the enemies of humanity. And Brother Darius of the Dark Angels, secretive and watchful, always seeming to know more than he was willing to share. It was a diverse team, and that diversity was both a strength and a source of friction. Each warrior brought the combat doctrines and cultural traditions of his home chapter, and those didn't always mesh smoothly. The Space Wolves thought the Ultramarines were too rigid. The Black Templars thought everyone was too restrained in their hatred of the enemy. The Dark Angels trusted no one fully, always holding something back. And all of them wondered about the Blackshield in their midst, the warrior who would not speak his name or his chapter, who seemed to carry a weight of sorrow that even decades of service couldn't lift. But in battle, Kill Team Kazarin was magnificent. They complemented each other's strengths, covered each other's weaknesses, and learned to function as a unified weapon despite their differences. And at the heart of that unity was Nullus, the Blackshield whose tactical expertise and deep understanding of Xenos behaviour made him invaluable to the team's success. Titus threw himself into his new role with the same intensity he had brought to every assignment in his career. If anything, his obsession with understanding Xenos grew even more pronounced. Without the responsibilities of command, without chapter politics or the need to navigate the complexities of being a captain, he could focus entirely on what he did best: studying the enemy, learning their ways, finding their weaknesses, and exploiting them with surgical precision. He fought Tyranids on ice worlds and in the crushing depths of underhives. He battled orc hordes on abandoned mining stations and amidst the ruins of lost colonies. He faced Eldar pirates, Tau expeditionary forces, and even more exotic Xenos threats like the parasitic Lacrimole and the horrifying Umbra. Each mission added to his already vast store of knowledge about how aliens thought, how they fought, and how they could be destroyed. But through it all, Titus never spoke of his past, never mentioned the Ultramarines or Graia or the chain of events that had brought him to the Deathwatch. His brothers in Kill Team Kazarin respected his silence, even as they wondered about it. They could see he was haunted, could recognize the signs of a warrior carrying heavy burdens, but they also saw that he was dependable, skilled, and utterly committed to the mission. That was enough. Years turned into decades. Titus served with distinction, his kill tally growing to legendary proportions, his expertise sought after for the most difficult and dangerous operations. He saw brothers come and go, some completing their Deathwatch service and returning to their chapters with honour, others falling in battle against the countless horrors that lurked in the void. He trained new arrivals, passed on his knowledge of Xenos to younger warriors who would benefit from his hard-won experience, and through it all, he never gave up hope. Hope that one day he would earn redemption, hope that one day he would be able to return to the chapter he'd been forced to leave, to stand once more alongside brothers who wore the blue and gold of Ultramar. Hope that the stain of suspicion could be washed away through decades of faithful service in the Emperor's name. That hope seemed impossibly distant when the call came that would change everything. The Fourth Tyrannic War had begun. Hive Fleet Leviathan, the largest Tyranid invasion force the Imperium had ever encountered, had emerged from beneath the galactic plane, striking systems throughout the galaxy's western reaches. And one of the worlds under threat was the jungle planet Kadaku in the Residius system, where the Adeptus Mechanicus had been conducting classified research under a project designation, Aurora. Blackshield Nullus and Kill Team Kassaran were deployed to Kadaku aboard a Corvus Blackstar, the Deathwatch's advanced stealth transport. Their mission was simple in concept but nearly impossible in execution. Penetrate deep into Tyranid-held territory, deploy a virus bomb that would neutralize the Xenos presence in a critical zone, and extract before the swarm could overwhelm them. It was a suicide mission, the kind that only the Deathwatch would even attempt, and every member of Kill Team Kassaran knew that their chances of survival were minimal at best. They never even made it to the surface intact. The Tyranids had already established air superiority over Kadaku, and the swarms of gargoyles that patrolled the skies tore into the Corvus Blackstar before it could reach its drop zone. The transport came apart in midair, torn open by bioplasma and razor-sharp claws, and the kill team was scattered across the jungle below. Titus, caught by a gargoyle, found himself separated from his brothers, fighting alone through miles of Tyranid-infested terrain to reach the rally point. By the time he reached the crash site, he discovered the bitter truth. His brothers were dead. Brother Ulfar, Brother Kelstros, Brother Beren, Brother Darius, all of them cut down by the swarm. The Corvus Blackstar was a smoking wreck, and the virus bomb it carried was still intact but damaged, its timer counting down toward deployment whether anyone was there to guide it or not. Titus could have extracted, could have called for emergency pickup and left the mission uncompleted. No one would have blamed him. He was the only survivor, and even Space Marines have limits to what they can accomplish alone. But that wasn't who. Demetrian Titus was. He had a mission. His brothers had died for that mission, and he would complete it, or die trying. He fought his way to the deployment point through wave after wave of Tyranid bioforms. He loaded the virus bomb onto its launch platform and armed it, setting the timer for detonation. And then, as he was preparing to find a way to extract, he encountered a creature that would nearly end his long career. A Carnifex, one of the Tyranid's heavy assault organisms, a living battering ram of chitin and muscle and murderous instinct. The battle was savage, a desperate close-quarters brawl between a single Space Marine and a creature that outweighed him several times over. Titus gave as good as he got, his chainsword tearing chunks from the Carnifex carapace, his bolter punching holes in its vital organs. But in the end, numbers and biology triumphed over skill. The Carnifex's scything talons found their mark, ripping through power armour and biting deep into Titus's body. He fell, blood streaming from massive wounds, life fading as his enhanced physiology struggled to cope with the catastrophic damage. As darkness closed in around him, as he felt his secondary heart begin to fail, and his consciousness start to slip away, Demetrian Titus, the warrior who had once been a captain, prepared to commend his soul to the Emperor. He had done his duty. The virus bomb would deploy. The mission would succeed. It was enough. It had to be enough. But the Emperor, it seemed, was not done with him yet. Because even as Titus's vision faded, as the sounds of battle grew distant and muffled, a new sound cut through the fog, the distinctive roar of Ultramarines' drop pods hitting the ground, the thunder of bolter fire as his old chapter arrived to reinforce the Deathwatch position. The Ultramarines' second company had arrived on Kadaku, and they were about to find the fallen warrior who had once been their captain, about to discover that he had been serving in the shadows all this time, about to bring him home at last. But that homecoming would come at a price, because the wounds Titus had suffered were too severe even for Space Marine physiology to heal. To save his life, he would need to undergo one of the most dangerous procedures in the Imperium, the Rubicon Primaris. And when he emerged from that crucible, if he emerged, Demetrian Titus would be reborn. Stronger, faster, more resilient than ever before. But also changed in ways he couldn't yet understand, thrust into a chapter and an Imperium that had continued to evolve during his decades of exile. The question was not whether he could survive the transformation. The question was whether, after everything he had been through, he could find his place in this new era, or if he would remain forever a warrior out of time. Consciousness returned slowly, painfully, like swimming up through dark water toward a distant light. Demetrian Titus became aware of sensations before he could process what they meant. The cold touch of metal against his skin, the distant sound of chanting voices, the rhythmic hum of machinery, and beneath it all a strange feeling of wrongness, as if his body didn't quite fit together the way it had before. Memory came next. The jungle of Kadaku, the mission, the Carnifex, falling, dying. He should be dead. Every instinct, every bit of training and experience told him that wounds like the ones he'd suffered were fatal even for a space marine. His blood had been pooling beneath him on the jungle floor. He'd felt his organs shutting down, felt the light fading from his eyes. But he wasn't dead. He was alive somehow, and the realization brought both relief and confusion. Where was he? What had happened? And why did everything feel so different, so strange? "Welcome back, brother." The voice was familiar but changed, deeper and resonant in a way Titus didn't immediately recognize. He opened his eyes and found himself staring up at a vaulted ceiling of plasteel and stone, the unmistakable architecture of a space marine apothecarian. But this was not just any medical facility. The scale was massive, the equipment sophisticated beyond anything he remembered, and standing over him was a figure in power armour that made his own old Mark VII suit seem almost quaint by comparison. Chaplain Leandros. The young warrior who had denounced him to the Inquisition all those decades ago was now a chaplain, a spiritual guardian of the chapter, his armour adorned with the symbols of his office and the skull-faced helmet that marked his role. And he was huge, bigger than any Space Marine Titus remembered, his armour more advanced, his presence more imposing. No, wait. It wasn't that Leandros had grown, it was that Titus himself had changed. He raised his hand before his face and saw it as if for the first time, larger, more powerful, the proportions subtly different from what he remembered. The realization hit him like a drop pod impact. The Calgarian rites, the Rubicon Primaris, they had transformed him while he lay dying, elevated him from a firstborn space marine to one of the new Primaris, the enhanced warriors that Archmagos Belisarius Cal had developed to reinforce the Imperium's battered defences. "You were dying," Chaplain Leandros explained, his voice carrying notes of something Titus couldn't quite identify. Regret? Uncertainty. The wounds the Carnifex inflicted were beyond the capacity of even our apothecaries to heal. Captain Acheron brought you to the Resilient, our battle barge, and transmitted your status to Chapter Master Calgar on Macragge. The Chapter Master himself gave the order. You were to be saved, whatever the cost. You were to undergo the Rubicon Primaris. The Rubicon Primaris. Even before his exile, Titus had heard whispers of the procedure, the dangerous process by which existing Space Marines could be upgraded with the additional organs and enhancements that made the Primaris superior to their firstborn brothers. It was called a Rubicon for good reason. Crossing it meant either transcending your previous limitations or dying in the attempt. The mortality rate was significant even under ideal conditions, and for a warrior with wounds as severe as Titus's, the chances of survival should have been minimal. But he had survived. More than survived. He had thrived. He could feel the changes throughout his body, the increased strength, the heightened reflexes, the additional organs working in concert with his original ones to push his capabilities beyond anything he had known before. His third lung was now supplemented by additional respiratory structures that would allow him to function in even more hostile environments. His Belisarian furnace, the new organ that allowed for brief surges of superhuman speed and strength, was already integrated into his nervous system. He was stronger, faster, more resilient than he had ever been. But physical transformation was only part of what was happening. As Titus regained full consciousness and began to process his situation, he learned the full truth of where he was and what it meant. He was aboard the Resilient, the battle barge of the Ultramarine Second Company. The same Second Company he had once commanded, now led by Captain Sevastus Acheron. The same brothers he had been forced to leave behind decades ago were now fighting to defend Kadaku against the Tyrannid swarm, and they had found him in the jungle, recognised him despite the black armour of the Deathwatch, and brought him home. Titus wanted to return to the Deathwatch immediately. It was where he belonged, where he had found purpose in the long years of exile. The shadows had become comfortable, familiar. He had no right to expect anything more, no right to ask for forgiveness or acceptance from the chapter he had been forced to leave. But Chaplain Leandros, with an intensity that surprised Titus, insisted that things had changed. The Inquisition had formally cleared Titus of all suspicion. The records of his decades of service in the Deathwatch, his kill tally, his unwavering loyalty and dedication, had erased any lingering doubts about his purity. More than that, Chapter Master Calgar himself had declared that Titus would return to the Ultramarines, would reclaim his name and his place among his brothers. There was only one complication. Captain Acheron now held the rank that Titus had once borne. The Second Company had a captain, and while Titus had been cleared of wrongdoing and welcomed back to the chapter, he could not simply resume his former position. That would be neither fair to a Charon, who had earned his rank through merit and service, nor practical given the decades that had passed and the changes the chapter had undergone. And so Demetrian Titus, former captain, former Blackshield, former exile, was reinstated to the Ultramarines as a lieutenant. It was a demotion in technical terms, a reduction in rank from his previous status. But for Titus it felt like a gift beyond price. He was home. He was among brothers again. He wore the blue and gold of Ultramar once more. Everything else was secondary. His first assignment came almost immediately. Kadaku was in the process of being evacuated, the Tyrannid presence too overwhelming to repel with the forces available. But critical intelligence and material needed to be secured before the world was abandoned. Captain Acheron assigned Titus to lead a squad in support of these operations, pairing him with two warriors, Sergeant Gadriel and Brother Chiron. Gadriel was young, brilliant, and ambitious. He had been born and raised in the era of the Primaris, knew nothing of the old firstborn ways except what he had learned from veterans. He was a by-the-book warrior who followed the Codex Astartes with the fervour of a true believer, and when he learned that his new lieutenant had once been a captain, that Titus had served for decades in the Deathwatch, the younger Marine didn't quite know what to make of it. There was respect there, certainly, but also wariness, a sense that this grizzled veteran represented something from an earlier age that Gadriel didn't fully understand. Chiron, by contrast, was calmer, more measured. He had the steady demeanour of a warrior who had seen his share of combat and come through it with his faith and purpose intact. He didn't question, didn't probe into Titus's past. He simply accepted his new lieutenant and focused on the mission at hand. That steadiness would prove invaluable in the trials ahead. Their first objective was to reclaim control of the orbital defence cannons that the Tyrannids had overrun. Without those cannons operational, the evacuation ships orbiting Kadaku were vulnerable to the Hive Fleet's bioships, massive living vessels that could swallow transports whole. The mission was brutally difficult, fighting through endless waves of Hormagaunts, Termagants, warriors, and worse. But Titus led his squad with the expertise of a veteran who had faced the Tyrannids countless times before, and they succeeded. The sight of the orbital defense cannons coming online, their targeting systems locking onto Tyranid bioships and unleashing devastating salvos of fire was one of the most beautiful things Titus had seen in years. One of the hive ships died screaming, its massive form breaking apart in orbit and raining down onto the planet below in a shower of burning biomass. It wouldn't stop the swarm, but it would buy precious time for the evacuation to continue. Next came the mission to escort Archmagus Nozick Beta 12, the head of Project Aurora, off-world. The Mechanicus had been conducting some kind of classified research on Cardaku, and whatever that research was, it was important enough that Nozick refused to evacuate without securing his data. It should have been a simple extraction, but nothing on Cardaku was simple anymore. The research facility was overrun, the Tyranids, swarming through its corridors in such numbers that even power-armoured Space Marines had to fight for every metre of ground. They reached the facility. They secured the data. They were on their way to the extraction point when everything went wrong. The Thunderhawk gunship carrying Archmagus Nozick was shot down, crashing in the jungle miles from any friendly forces. And when Titus and his squad reached the crash site, they discovered something that made the Tyranid threat seem almost secondary: signs of chaos corruption. The bodies they found weren't just killed by the crash. They had been executed, their deaths ritualistic and deliberate. Symbols had been scratched into the hull of the downed Thunderhawk, marks that made Titus's enhanced vision blur and his second heart beat faster. He knew these signs, had seen them on Graia, a lifetime ago. Chaos was here. In the middle of a Tyranid invasion, with billions of lives at stake and worlds burning, somehow the forces of the ruinous powers had found a way to infiltrate this theatre of war. Archmagus Nozick was dead, his life's work potentially compromised or stolen. The data he had been so desperate to protect was gone, taken by whoever had killed him. And as Titus reported this to Captain Acheron, as he watched Sergeant Gadriel's expression shift from confusion to horror, he knew that this war was about to become far more complicated. The Residius system wasn't just facing a Tyranid invasion. It was the site of a three-way conflict, with the Imperium caught between the endless hunger of the Hive Fleet and the malevolent intelligence of Chaos. The Fourth Tyrannic War had just revealed itself to be far more than a simple invasion. It was a chess game being played on multiple levels, with stakes that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. And Demetrian Titus, the warrior who had been betrayed because of his mysterious resistance to warp corruption, was about to find himself once again confronting the very powers that had cost him everything. Only this time, he wouldn't be alone. This time, he would have brothers at his side, warriors who trusted him despite his past, who looked to him for leadership despite his reduced rank. The campaign across the Residius system would test everything Titus had learned in his long career. It would force him to confront not just external enemies but internal doubts, to prove himself worthy of the trust his brothers placed in him. And it would ultimately reveal a plot so audacious, so dangerous, that failure would mean not just the loss of a few worlds but potentially the doom of entire sectors. The story of how Lieutenant Titus saved the Residius system, exposed a chaos plot that reached deep into the heart of Imperial institutions and finally truly earned his redemption, deserves its own telling. But the relevant point for our purposes is this: by the time the dust settled, by the time the last Tyranid had been purged and the last Chaos cultist executed, Demetrian Titus had proven beyond any shadow of doubt that he was exactly what he appeared to be. A loyal warrior of the Imperium, a son of Guilliman, and an Ultramarine through and through. The suspicion was gone, the whispers had ceased, and when the chaplain who had once denounced him approached Titus after the final battle, when Leandros removed his skull-faced helmet and looked into the eyes of the warrior he had wronged so many years ago, what passed between them was understanding. Leandros had been young, zealous and afraid. He had made a mistake, one that had cost a good man decades of exile. But he had also spent those decades growing, learning, becoming something more than the rigid ideologue who had once believed that any deviation from doctrine was heresy. They didn't speak of forgiveness. They didn't need to. The war they had just fought together, the battles they had survived side by side, spoke louder than any words. They were brothers. They were Ultramarines, and that was enough. But even as one chapter of Titus's story closed, another was opening. Because the Tyrannid threat hadn't ended. Hive Fleet Leviathan wasn't defeated, merely driven back. And across the galaxy, on the other side of the Great Rift, the 500 worlds of Ultramar faced their own crises, their own invasions, their own desperate struggles for survival. Roboute Guilliman had returned to the Imperium. The Primarch, the living son of the Emperor, had been resurrected and now waged the Indomitus Crusade across 1,000 battlefields, fighting to reclaim what chaos had taken, to restore some semblance of order to a galaxy tearing itself apart. But Guilliman could not be everywhere, could not protect every world personally, had to rely on warriors he trusted, officers he knew would hold the line no matter the odds. And when the time came to defend Ultramar's heart, when the eastern sectors of the 500 worlds came under threat from an enemy even more ancient than the Tyrannids, even more implacable than chaos, Guilliman would need someone he could trust absolutely, someone who had proven their loyalty beyond any question, someone who understood what it meant to be the last line of defense. He would need Demetrian Titus. And this time, Titus would not be serving as a lieutenant, subordinate to another captain. This time, he would reclaim the rank he had once held, the responsibility he had been born to bear. This time, Captain Demetrian Titus, Master of the Watch, would stand at the head of the Ultramarines' second company as they faced the greatest threat the 500 worlds had seen in generations. But before we can understand that final stand, before we can appreciate the magnitude of what Titus would face, we need to understand what the 500 worlds actually are, what they represent, and why their defense matters not just to the Ultramarines but to the entire Imperium. We need to journey back through 10,000 years of history, through triumph and tragedy, through expansion and loss, to understand how Ultramar became the crown jewel of the Imperium, and why its fall would be a catastrophe from which humanity might never recover. In all the galaxy, spanning 1,000,000 worlds and encompassing countless systems, there is no region quite like Ultramar. It is often called the Imperium within the Imperium, a semi-autonomous realm where the vision of one man, one of the Emperor's greatest sons, created something that approached what humanity's galactic empire was always meant to be. To understand why the defense of the 500 worlds matters so much, we must first understand what they are, how they came to be, and what they represent. The story begins long before the Imperium existed, in the dark days of the Age of Strife, when humanity's first galactic empire collapsed into barbarism and isolation. For 5,000 years, human worlds were cut off from each other, surrounded by warp storms that made interstellar travel impossible. Civilizations that had reached the heights of technological achievement fell into savagery, or were destroyed by Xenos predators who took advantage of humanity's weakness. But some worlds survived. Some preserved their knowledge, maintained their technology, and even prospered in isolation. Macragge was one such world, a planet of strategic importance located in the Ultima Segmentum, on the far eastern reaches of the galaxy. When the Age of Strife ended and the Emperor launched his great crusade to reunite humanity, he discovered Macragge already well governed under the rule of a man named Connor Uton, who served as one of its consuls. But Connor's reign was troubled by rebellion, and in the conflict that followed, he adopted a young boy who had been found in the mountains, apparently abandoned or lost. This boy was special, gifted with abilities far beyond those of normal humans, and as he grew, he demonstrated genius-level intelligence, superhuman physical capabilities, and an instinctive gift for leadership and administration. Connor named him Roboute, and the boy repaid that trust by growing into a remarkable young man. When Connor was assassinated by rival nobles, Young Roboute led the loyalist forces that crushed the rebellion. He then reorganised Macragge's entire society, creating a system of government that was both efficient and just, that valued merit over birth, that protected the weak while enabling the strong to flourish. Under his leadership, Macragge transformed from a troubled world into a beacon of civilization, its cities rebuilt in gleaming marble and steel, its armies well-equipped and disciplined, its trade networks extending to neighbouring systems despite the dangers of warp travel. But Roboute Guilliman, as he was now known, was not merely a ruler of one world. He had studied the ancient texts preserved in Macragge's libraries, had read accounts of humanity's lost empire, and he dreamed of something greater. He coined a term from those ancient writings, Ultramar, beyond the Sea of Night, a realm of human worlds united not by conquest, but by mutual benefit, by shared culture and values, by the understanding that together they could achieve what isolated worlds could not. He began reaching out to neighbouring systems, establishing trade routes protected by Macragge's growing fleet. Where necessary, he waged short, victorious wars against hostile powers that threatened his growing network of allied worlds. By the time the Emperor of Mankind arrived in the Ultima Segmentum, leading the forces of the Great Crusade, he found not a single world, but an emerging interstellar empire of over 500 worlds, all of them prosperous, well-governed, and loyal to the man they called the Lord of Macragge. The Emperor recognised immediately what he had found. One of his lost sons, the Primarchs, the genetically engineered demigods he had created to lead his Space Marine legions in the conquest of the galaxy. Roboute Guilliman was the Primarch of the 13th Legion, the Ultramarines, and when the Emperor offered him command of that legion, Guilliman accepted on one condition, that his realm of Ultramar would be preserved, that the worlds he had united would remain under his protection, and that the Imperium would respect their relative autonomy. The Emperor agreed. More than that, he encouraged Guilliman's approach, seeing in Ultramar a model for what the rest of the Imperium could become. Not a collection of conquered territories squeezed for resources and left to rot, but integrated members of a greater whole, their prosperity ensuring the prosperity of all. The 500 worlds became the recruiting ground for the Ultramarines Legion, supplying not just warriors, but the food, weapons, and material the Legion needed to wage its campaigns across the galaxy. Under Guilliman's leadership during the Great Crusade, the Ultramarines became the largest and most successful of the Space Marine legions. They conquered more worlds than any other legion, save perhaps the Lunar Wolves, and critically, they left those worlds in better condition than they found them. Where other Primarchs saw compliance as an end in itself, Guilliman saw it as a beginning. He established governments, rebuilt infrastructure, educated populations, and integrated conquered worlds into the Imperium in ways that made them productive contributors rather than resentful subjects. The 500 worlds prospered during this golden age. They were safe, protected by one of the most powerful military forces in the galaxy. They were wealthy, connected to trade networks that spanned the Imperium. They were administered efficiently, with a system of tetrarchs overseeing major sectors of the realm and reporting directly to Guilliman. For a brief, shining moment, Ultramar represented everything the Imperium was supposed to be. But then came the Horus heresy. The Warmaster Horus, the Emperor's favourite son, turned traitor and led half the legions in rebellion against the Imperium. It was the greatest catastrophe in human history, a civil war that nearly tore the galaxy apart. And when Horus realised he needed to keep the Ultramarines from reaching terror and defending the Emperor, he sent 2 entire traitor legions, the Word-Bearers and the World-Eaters, with one mission: destroy Ultramar. The Shadow Crusade, as it came to be known, was devastation on a scale difficult to comprehend. The Word-Bearers and World-Eaters fell upon the 500 worlds like a plague, burning their way from system to system, leaving nothing but ashes and corpses in their wake. Entire planets were reduced to lifeless rocks. Populations numbering in the billions were slaughtered or dragged off to be sacrificed to the Chaos Gods. The Ultramarines fought desperately to defend their realm, but they were outnumbered, outmanoeuvred, and caught completely off guard by the betrayal of brother legions they had once fought alongside. The Battle of Calth was the worst single engagement. The Word-bearers, pretending to be loyal, lured the Ultramarines into a trap and launched a devastating surprise attack. Over 120,000 Ultramarines died in that one battle. The surface of Calth was scoured clean of life, its atmosphere burned away, its cities reduced to molten slag. The Ultramarines would eventually take revenge, pursuing the traitors deep into the warp and making them pay for their treachery, but the damage was done. By the time the Horus Heresy ended, with the Emperor entombed on the Golden Throne and Horus dead, the 500 worlds had been reduced to a fraction of their former glory. Hundreds of worlds had been destroyed, depopulated, or so badly damaged that they could no longer support significant populations. The Ultramarines Legion had lost over half its strength. The infrastructure that Guilliman had built over decades was in ruins, and then came the breaking of the legions. Guilliman himself, now appointed as the Emperor's Lord Commander, and charged with rebuilding the shattered Imperium, authored the Codex Astartes, that monumental work that reorganised the Space Marine legions into smaller chapters. It was necessary, he argued, to ensure that no single commander could ever again command the kind of overwhelming force that Horus had used to nearly destroy the Imperium. The legions were too powerful, too dangerous. They had to be broken up. As part of this reformation, Guilliman also reduced his own realm. The 500 worlds were broken up, many granted independence, others redistributed to successor chapters of the Ultramarines. By the time the Reformation was complete, the realm that had once encompassed over 500 systems had been reduced to just 8 worlds in the 41st millennium, a pale shadow of its former glory. For 10,000 years this smaller Ultramar persisted. It remained more prosperous and better governed than most imperial regions, but it was a far cry from the Empire within an empire that it had once been. The Ultramarines recruited from these 8 worlds, defended them against innumerable threats, and maintained the vision of order and progress that Guilliman had established. But always there was the memory of what had been lost, the knowledge that the 500 worlds had once existed and could perhaps exist again. Throughout the millennia, Ultramar faced countless threats. The Tyranids came in the First Tyrannic War, Hive Fleet behemoth nearly overwhelming Macraga before the Ultramarines, at terrible cost, destroyed the invasion. Chaos warbands raided the realm's borders. Orcs launched periodic wars that had to be crushed before they gained momentum. Eldar pirates struck at vulnerable worlds and disappeared before retaliation could be organised. Each threat was met and defeated, but each victory came at a cost, slowly grinding down the defences and the populations of the remaining worlds. Then, at the end of the 41st millennium, everything changed. The 13th Black Crusade saw Abaddon the Despoiler finally achieve his objective, shattering Cadia and tearing open the Great Rift, a massive warp storm that split the galaxy in two. Ultramar, like everywhere else in the Imperium, found itself besieged on all sides. The forces of Nurgle, led by the demon Primarch Mortarion, invaded the realm in what became known as the Plague Wars, seeking to corrupt Guilliman's legacy and turn Ultramar into a garden of pestilence. But something miraculous happened. Roboute Guilliman returned. The Primarch, who had been in stasis for 10,000 years after being mortally wounded by his traitorous brother Fulgrim, was resurrected through a combination of Mechanicus technology and the power of the Eldari god of the dead. He returned to find the Imperium he had helped build transformed into a nightmarish parody of everything he had fought for, a rotting corpse of an empire held together by superstition and bureaucracy, rather than reason and progress. But he also returned with a plan. He brought with him the Primaris Space Marines, enhanced warriors developed by Archimagos Belisarius Kol over the preceding 10 millennia. He brought new weapons, new technologies, and most importantly, new hope. He drove Mortarion and the forces of Nurgle from Ultramar, ending the Plague Wars with a series of brilliant campaigns that reminded the galaxy why Roboute Guilliman was considered one of the greatest military minds humanity had ever produced. And then he made a declaration that sent shockwaves through the region. Ultramar would be restored to its original glory. The 500 worlds would rise again. All the treaties and agreements that had reduced Guilliman's realm over the millennia were declared null and void. Worlds that had once been part of Ultramar would be brought back into the fold, whether through negotiation or, if necessary, through force. The realm would be rebuilt, fortified, and made strong enough to serve as a beacon of what the Imperium could be. The Ultramarian Reclamation began. Fleets sailed out from Macraga, reclaiming lost worlds, integrating them back into Ultramar's administrative structure, and establishing new defences. Guilliman ordered that 10 full Space Marine chapters would be permanently stationed in Ultramar, providing over 10,000 Astartes to defend the realm at all times. Massive star fortresses were constructed or reactivated to guard critical systems. The Ultramar Defence Fleet, the naval arm of the realm's military, was expanded and modernised. Everything that could be done to ensure Ultramar's survival was done, but even Guilliman, for all his genius and determination, could not be everywhere at once. He had responsibilities beyond Ultramar. As the Lord Commander of the Imperium, he had to lead the Indomitus Crusade, a galaxy-spanning effort to reclaim lost worlds and stabilise regions cut off by the Great Rift. He had to deal with the politics of terror, managing the High Lords and ensuring that the Imperium's government functioned well enough to support the military efforts he was leading. He had to coordinate defences across dozens of sectors, allocate resources among countless battlefronts, and make impossible choices about which worlds could be saved and which had to be sacrificed, which meant that the defence of Ultramar itself, the protection of those 500 worlds he was working so hard to restore, had to be entrusted to others, to warriors he could trust absolutely, to officers who understood what was at stake and who would hold the line no matter the cost, to men like Marneus Calgar, the chapter master of the Ultramarines, who administered the realm in Guilliman's absence, to men like the various tetrarchs who governed the major sectors of Ultramar, and to men like Demetrian Titus, who would be given the most critical mission of all, securing Ultramar's interior while others pushed outward to reclaim the borders. Because even as the Ultramarian Reclamation progressed, even as world after world was brought back into the fold, threats continued to multiply. The Tyranids hadn't gone away. Chaos warbands still prowled the void, seeking weakness to exploit. And rising from tomb worlds scattered throughout the region, an ancient enemy was stirring, an enemy older than the Imperium, older than humanity's first galactic empire, an enemy that remembered when the stars were young and considered all organic life to be nothing more than an infestation to be eradicated. The Necrons were waking, and they wanted their worlds back. The worlds that had become the 500 worlds of Ultramar had once been theirs 60 million years ago, before they underwent the biotransference that transformed them from flesh and blood into living metal, before they entered the Great Sleep to wait out the ages. Now they were returning, and they did not recognise any claim that upstart mortals might have to worlds that the Necrons had ruled when humans were still primitive apes in Terra's African grasslands. The stage was being set for a war that would determine not just the fate of Ultramar but potentially the entire eastern reaches of the Imperium, and at the centre of that war would be one man, one warrior, who had been tested and tempered in fires that would have destroyed lesser souls, who had earned redemption through decades of faithful service, and who was about to face his greatest challenge yet. Demetrian Titus was coming home, not to rest, not to bask in recognition, but to lead, to defend, to stand as the bulwark between civilization and annihilation. The 500 worlds needed a champion, and in the grim darkness of the far future, Titus would answer that call. To truly understand the crisis facing Ultramar, to grasp why Titus's defence of the realm is so critical, we need to step back and look at the bigger picture. we need to understand the state of the galaxy in the early 42nd millennium, the Era Indomitus, when everything humanity had built over 10,000 years teetered on the brink of collapse, and only the most desperate measures offered any hope of survival. The 13th Black Crusade marked a turning point in Imperial history. For millennia, the Imperium had been slowly dying, bleeding out from 1,000 wounds, losing ground inch by inch to enemies on all sides. But it had been a slow process, a gradual decline that could be ignored or denied by those who didn't want to face the truth. The fall of Cadia and the birth of the Great Rift changed that. Suddenly the decline was no longer gradual. Suddenly, the Imperium was in its death throes, and everyone knew it. The Great Rift, that massive warp storm that tore across the galaxy from the Eye of Terror to the Hadex anomaly, physically divided the Imperium in two. On one side was the Imperium Sanctus, the half of Imperial space that remained in relatively stable contact with Terra, and where the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that allowed for warp travel, could still be detected. On the other side was the Imperium Nihilus, the Dark Imperium, cut off from the light of the Emperor, isolated and alone against horrors beyond counting. Chaos flowed through the Great Rift like blood from a wound. Demon worlds materialized in real space, bringing with them all the nightmares of the warp. Entire sectors fell to corruption overnight, as populations went mad from the psychic pressure, as latent psychers transformed into gates for demonic invasion, as the veil between reality and the immaterium grew so thin that simply thinking the wrong thoughts could tear holes in existence. The Tyranids, sensing weakness, redoubled their invasions. Hive Fleet Leviathan, the largest Tyranid threat the galaxy had ever seen, emerged from beneath the galactic plane, striking systems throughout the western reaches. Unlike previous hive fleets that had invaded from the eastern fringe, Leviathan came from below, attacking worlds that had never faced the Tyranid threat before, overwhelming defences that had been designed to face chaos or orcs, but had no experience with the endless hunger of the swarm. Orcs, sensing that a good fight was happening everywhere, launched wars across the galaxy, seeking out the largest battles they could find and joining in with their typical enthusiasm for violence. Eldar schemers saw opportunities to advance their own mysterious agendas, striking at unexpected targets for reasons only they understood. The Toe Empire continued its expansion in the eastern fringe, claiming imperial worlds and offering populations a choice between joining their greater good or being conquered. And in the galactic north, the Necrons continued their awakening, Tomb World after Tomb World coming online, ancient machines of war stirring from 60 million years of slumber to reclaim what they considered rightfully theirs. The Imperium was dying, everyone knew it. The question was whether anyone could do anything about it, or if humanity's long, slow extinction had finally entered its terminal phase, and then Roboute Guilliman returned from the dead. His resurrection, his journey from Macragge to Terra, and his assumption of the role of Lord Commander of the Imperium has been chronicled extensively elsewhere. What matters for our purposes is what he did next. He launched the Indomitus Crusade, the largest military mobilization the Imperium had seen since the Great Crusade 10,000 years before. It was an act of desperate audacity. Guilliman gathered every warrior, every ship, every weapon he could muster, organized them into massive fleet groups, and sent them out into the burning galaxy with orders to reclaim what had been lost, to stabilize what could be stabilized, and to hold the line against the darkness. He personally led Fleet Primus, the largest of these battle groups, on a circuit through the Imperium Sanctus, making short warp jumps from system to system, because the Astronomicon was so unreliable that longer jumps risked being lost in the warp forever. The Primaris Space Marines made their debut during the Indomitus Crusade, and their impact was immediate. These enhanced warriors, bigger and stronger than traditional Space Marines, brought with them new weapons and new hope. They reinforced chapters that had been ground down to mere dozens of warriors, reformed chapters that had been declared extinct, and even founded new chapters to fill gaps in the Imperium's defences. The Ultima founding, as it came to be known, created hundreds of new chapters, a massive expansion of the Adeptus Astartes that gave the Imperium military strength it hadn't possessed in millennia. But for all the Crusade's successes, for all the worlds reclaimed and enemies defeated, it came at a terrible cost. Not just in lives lost, though the casualty figures were staggering, running into the trillions when you counted mortal soldiers and civilians caught in the fighting. The real cost was measured in the worlds that couldn't be saved, the populations that screamed for help but received none because the Crusade fleets had to keep moving, had to maintain their momentum or risk being bogged down in wars of attrition they couldn't win. Guilliman heard those screams, every distress call that went unanswered, every plea for aid that was marked as beyond our capacity to assist, every world that fell while the Crusade fleets were 100 systems away, fighting different battles. He carried them all with him, a burden of guilt and grief that would have crushed a lesser being. But he couldn't stop, couldn't afford to become distracted by individual tragedies when the survival of the entire species was at stake. So he pushed forward, made the hard choices, authorized exterminatus on worlds that couldn't be saved to deny them to the enemy, and tried not to think too much about the billions of loyal Imperial citizens he was condemning to death. The Crusade went on for over a century, though with time so distorted by the warp storms, nobody could say for certain exactly how long it lasted. What looked like a year on Terra might be a decade or a month on some distant world. Fleets that launched within weeks of each other arrived at their destinations years apart. Communication became a nightmare of delayed messages and contradictory reports as astropaths struggled to send their messages through the roiling turbulence of the warp. Gradually, painfully, the situation stabilized. The Great Rift didn't close, but it stopped expanding. The Imperium Nihilus remained isolated, but its worlds learned to survive on their own, or they died. The Chaos advance was checked, not defeated, but at least contained. The Tyranid invasion continued, but defensive networks were established, fallback positions fortified, evacuation protocols put in place. The galaxy was still burning, but humanity had at least managed to grab some fire extinguishers and was fighting back, and through it all, Roboute Guilliman remained the driving force, the one person who could see the whole board, who understood the strategic situation on a galactic scale, and could make the decisions that needed to be made. He reorganized the Imperium's government, purging corrupt officials and replacing them with people who were merely incompetent rather than actively malicious, which was the best he could hope for. He reformed military command structures, giving field commanders more autonomy, while establishing better communication networks so that intelligence could flow where it was needed. He authorized new weapon technologies, new ship designs, new tactical doctrines that took into account the lessons learned from decades of constant warfare. But even Guilliman, for all his superhuman capabilities, for all his genius and determination, had limits. He couldn't be everywhere, couldn't fight every battle personally, had to delegate, had to trust others to carry out his vision and hold the line in his absence. And nowhere was that delegation more critical than in Ultramar itself. Because while Guilliman was waging wars across the galaxy, his own realm faced its own crises. The Plague Wars had devastated Ultramar, and though Mortarion had been driven off, the damage remained. Worlds needed to be decontaminated, populations resettled, infrastructure rebuilt. The ambitious project to restore the 500 worlds required constant attention, constant resources, constant protection against the enemies that sought to undo everything Guilliman was building. The Primarch established a system of governance that allowed Ultramar to function in his absence. The Tetrarchs ruled their sectors with considerable autonomy, managing local crises and coordinating defences. Chapter Master Marneus Calgar, the Lord of Macraga, served as the overall administrator of the realm when Guilliman was away. The 10 chapters stationed in Ultramar provided military force beyond what the Ultramar Auxiliar and Defence Fleet could manage alone. It was a system designed to ensure that Ultramar could survive and prosper, even when its Primarch was leading campaigns on the other side of the galaxy. But systems, no matter how well designed, need the right people to make them work, and as threats multiplied, as the enemies facing Ultramar grew more numerous and more dangerous, Guilliman needed warriors he could trust absolutely to hold critical positions. Warriors with the skill, experience and determination to stand against any threat. Warriors who understood what Ultramar represented and would defend it to their last breath. He needed warriors like Demetrian Titus. And when the Necron threat in the eastern sectors reached critical levels, when an ancient evil rose from its tomb world and launched a campaign of eradication that threatened to consume entire sectors of newly reclaimed worlds, Guilliman knew exactly who he would call upon to face it. Titus had proven himself in the Residius system, had demonstrated his tactical brilliance and unwavering loyalty. More than that, he embodied something Guilliman valued above almost everything else: the ability to adapt, to think independently while remaining true to core principles, to follow the spirit of the Codex Astartes rather than just its letter. That flexibility, that capacity for independent thought and action, would be essential in the war to come. And so, in a ceremony attended by the highest-ranking officers of the Ultramarines and overseen by Guilliman himself, Demetrian Titus was restored to his former rank. No longer Lieutenant Titus, subordinate to Captain Acheron, once again Captain Titus, commander of the Ultramarine 2nd Company, and more than that, Master of the Watch, charged with defending Ultramar's interior while others pushed outward to reclaim the borders of the 500 worlds. It was a promotion earned through blood and fire, through decades of faithful service in the shadows, through trials that would have broken lesser men, and it came with a responsibility that would test everything Titus had learned, everything he had become, because the Necron threat facing Ultramar wasn't just another Xenos invasion to be repelled with bolter-fire and blade. It was something far more dangerous, far more insidious, led by a figure whose very existence threatened to corrupt and doom every Necron it encountered, and whose ultimate goal was nothing less than the resurrection of a god. Nekrosor Ammentar was coming to Ultramar, and Captain Demetrian Titus would have to stop him, or watch the 500 worlds burn. The ceremony took place in the chapter's fortress of Hera on Macragge, in the same hall where chapter masters had been invested for 10,000 years. It was a place heavy with history, its walls adorned with battle honours and relics from campaigns dating back to the Horus Heresy. Every great champion of the chapter had stood in this hall at some point, and now Demetrian Titus would join their ranks. Primarch Roboute Guilliman himself presided over the ceremony, a towering figure in his armour of fate, wielding the Emperor's sword, that ancient blade that had once been the Emperor's own, and now served as his son's weapon. Around him stood the chapter's command structure: Chapter Master Marneus Calgar, Master of Sanctity Titus Cassius, Chief Librarian Varro Tigurius, and the captains of the other companies. And there, stepping forward from the ranks, was veteran Sergeant Matarus, the man who had first spotted potential in a boy on Tarentus over 2 centuries ago, who had recommended him for recruitment, and who had never stopped believing in him even during the long years of exile. It was Matarus who carried the captain's laurels, Matarus who would officially restore Titus to the rank he had once held. Guilliman's voice rang out through the hall, amplified by the excellent acoustics to ensure everyone present could hear every word. He spoke of duty and honour, of the trials that forge heroes, of the fact that sometimes the greatest warriors are those who have known defeat and risen from it stronger than before. He spoke of the threats facing Ultramar, of the need for leaders who could think as well as fight, who could inspire as well as command, who understood that protecting the Imperium meant protecting the people within it, not just the territory on a map. And then Matarus stepped forward, and in a voice thick with emotion that he didn't bother to hide, he spoke directly to Titus. He spoke of the boy he had found on Tarentus, fearless even in the face of death. He spoke of the warrior that boy had become, excelling at every trial, mastering every challenge. He spoke of the captain who had led with wisdom and courage, who had saved Graia even at the cost of his own position. He spoke of the exile who had served without recognition or reward, who had never complained, never faltered, never given up hope. And he spoke of the veteran who had returned and proven beyond any doubt that his loyalty had never wavered. Then Mataurus placed the laurels on Titus's head, the golden leaves that marked him as a captain of the Ultramarines, and the assembled warriors roared their approval. It was a sound that shook the walls, a thunder of ceramite fists pounding against chest plates in the traditional salute, and in that moment Titus knew that he was truly home. Not just physically, not just officially, but in the hearts and minds of his brothers. The suspicion was gone. The doubt had been erased. He was Captain Demetrian Titus once more, and this time nothing would take that from him. But the ceremony wasn't over, because Guilliman had more than a rank to bestow. He had a mission. Captain Titus, the Primarch's voice cut through the noise, bringing instant silence. You have been restored to your rightful place among the Ultramarines, but restoration of rank is not the same as assignment of duty. The second company needs a leader, yes, but Ultramar needs more than that. It needs a defender, someone who can secure its heart while others push outward to reclaim its borders. Guilliman gestured, and a hololithic display materialized in the center of the hall showing Ultramar and its surrounding sectors. The 500 worlds were marked in blue, Imperial territory secured and stable. But to the east there were red markers, dozens of them, indicating enemy forces. And at the center of that red swarm was a single pulsing icon that seemed to draw the eye like a black hole draws light. The Vespator Front, Guilliman continued, the eastern sector of Ultramar, currently under assault by Necron forces. Not a conventional invasion, not a simple attempt to conquer territory. This is a destroyer crusade, led by a Necron so ancient and so terrifying that even other Necrons fear to speak its name. Nekrosor Ammentar, thought by many to be the genesis of the Destroyer curse itself, has risen from its tomb world and leads a horde of corrupted Necrons in a campaign of extermination. It seeks to eradicate all life from the sector, to scour every world clean of organic matter, and then to move on to the next sector and repeat the process. The hololithic display zoomed in, showing specific worlds under threat, Imperial forces fighting desperate holding actions, evacuation routes choked with refugee ships. It was a nightmare scenario, and everyone in the hall could see that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. More than that, Guilliman's voice hardened. Ammentar seeks to reunite the scattered shards of the Nightbringer, the Cetan god of death itself. If it succeeds, if even a fraction of that star god's power is restored and brought to bear against Ultramar, the devastation would be incalculable. We must stop it. We must hold the Vespator Front, and I am entrusting that mission to you. Titus felt the weight of every eye in the hall on him as he stepped forward. My lord, I will not fail. Guilliman nodded, then gestured again. This time the hololithic display shifted to show not just tactical data, but personnel files, images of warriors and support staff who would form Titus's command structure. You will not face this alone. I am assigning you a command coterie, warriors and specialists who will serve as your advisors and help you coordinate the defence. They will be known as the Wardens of Ultramar, and through them you will have access to every resource the realm can provide. The first image that appeared was familiar. Ancient Gadriel, the warrior who had fought alongside Titus in the Residius system, who had gone from suspicious of the veteran to becoming one of his most loyal supporters. Ancient Gadriel will serve as your standard bearer, Guilliman explained. He is young, but he has proven himself in battle and earned rapid promotion to the rank of Ancient. He will carry the Second Company's banner into every engagement and serve as your link to the younger generation of Primaris Marines. The next image showed veteran Sergeant Mataurus himself, still in his firstborn armour despite being eligible for the Rubicon Primaris. Matoris has refused promotion beyond his current rank, preferring to remain with the warriors he has trained and led for so long. He will serve as your tactical advisor and as a connection to the chapter's veterans, many of whom served under him at some point in their careers. Then came new faces, people Titus hadn't worked with before but whose files showed impressive credentials. Fleet Commander Gaius Silva, a mortal officer who'd been managing the Ultramar Defence Fleet's operations in the eastern sectors with skill that had impressed even Guilliman. His ability to coordinate naval assets would be crucial in a campaign where void superiority could make the difference between victory and defeat. Amelia Minervas, a colonel in the Ultramar Defence Auxilia, the massive mortal army that fought alongside the Astartes. She would serve as the liaison between Titus's Space Marines and the billions of guard soldiers who form the bulk of Ultramar's military forces. The Necrons were coming in numbers that even Space Marines couldn't face alone. They would need the Auxilia, and Minervas would ensure that the mortal forces were properly coordinated and supported. Lucia Vesta, a diplomat whose specialty was negotiating with reluctant or stubborn imperial officials, nobles who might have their own agendas, and even representatives of other Xeno species when circumstances required it. War wasn't just about killing the enemy. It was about maintaining alliances, securing supply lines, and ensuring that everyone who needed to be working together actually did so, rather than pursuing personal ambitions. And finally, Dienel Cornelius, an astropath whose age was measured in centuries, whose power was such that he could maintain communication across the sector even when the warp storms raged their worst. The Necrons had a disturbing ability to disrupt psychic communication, their very existence creating a dead zone in the warp that made astropathic messages difficult or impossible. Cornelius's skill would be essential in ensuring that Titus's orders reached his forces and that intelligence flowed where it needed to go. These are the Wardens of Ultramar, Guilliman concluded. Through them, you will command not just the Second Company, but a multi-theatre defence network spanning the entire eastern sector. You will coordinate with the other chapters stationed in Ultramar, with the Defence Fleet, with the Auxilia, with every Imperial force in the region. You will be my voice in the east, my eyes watching for threats, my hand striking at our enemies. This is a responsibility beyond anything you have borne before, Captain Titus, but I believe you are ready for it. Prove me right. And with that the ceremony was concluded. Captain Demetrian Titus, Master of the Watch, took his place at the head of the Second Company and prepared to lead them into the most dangerous campaign of his long career. The Wardens of Ultramar assembled, each one bringing unique skills and perspectives to the command structure. Together they would plan the defence, coordinate the counter-offensives, and stand as the bulwark between Ultramar and the ancient evil that sought to consume it. But before they could even begin that work, they needed to understand exactly what they were facing. The Necrons were not like other enemies the Imperium had fought. They did not die easily, could repair damage that would destroy other warriors, and possessed technology so advanced that it seemed like magic to those who witnessed it. And Destroyer Necrons were the worst of all, corrupted by a nihilistic hatred of all life, transformed into something that barely remembered what they had once been and cared only for the extermination of every living thing in the galaxy. Nekrosor Ammentar represented the apex of that corruption, a Destroyer Lord so ancient and so powerful that its very existence was a threat not just to Ultramar, but to every living being within a dozen sectors. Understanding Ammentar, learning its capabilities and weaknesses, would be essential to defeating it. And so Titus threw himself into studying the enemy, reading every report, every intelligence briefing, every scrap of information that could be found about the Necrons in general, and the Destroyer Curse in particular. What he learned chilled him to his core. Because Ammentar wasn't just another enemy to be defeated in battle, it was a force of nature, a living apocalypse that corrupted everything around it, that turned even loyal Necrons into extensions of its will, that sought not just victory, but the complete annihilation of all organic life. Fighting, It would require more than superior tactics and firepower. It would require understanding the very nature of the Destroyer Curse, and finding a way to break its hold before it consumed not just Ammentar's forces, but potentially the defenders of Ultramar themselves. The war ahead would not just be fought with bolters and blades, it would be a battle for survival itself, a struggle to preserve not just territory, but the very concept of life in a universe where ancient machines sought to return the galaxy to the cold, sterile perfection they remembered from 60 million years ago. And Captain Titus, the warrior who'd been tested in every conceivable way, would have to find a way to triumph against odds that seemed impossible even by the Imperium's grim standards. The stage was set, the forces were assembled, the enemy was coming, and on the Vespator Front, where the fate of the 500 worlds would be decided, Captain Demetrian Titus prepared to make his stand. To understand the threat facing Ultramar, to truly grasp the magnitude of what Titus and his wardens must overcome, we must delve into the darkest secrets of the Necron race. We must understand the Destroyer Curse, that terrible affliction that transforms even the most noble of Necrons into nihilistic engines of genocide. And we must confront the figure at the centre of it all, Nekrosor Ammentar, a name that is spoken in whispers even among the deathless legions of the Necron dynasties. The Necrons were not always machines. 60 million years ago they were the Necronter, a flesh and blood species cursed with short, pain-filled lives due to the radiation from their sun. When they encountered the star gods known as the Citan, they were offered a solution to their suffering: biotransference, the process by which their consciousness would be uploaded into living metal bodies that would never age, never sicken, never die. It seemed like a gift from the gods themselves. It was a trap. The Citan betrayed the Necrontyr, consuming their souls during the transfer process, leaving behind only hollow echoes of what they had been. The Necrons awoke in their new bodies to find themselves soulless, emotionless, their personalities reduced to shadows of their former selves. They had achieved immortality, but at the cost of everything that made life worth living. For most Necrons, this loss manifested as a kind of detached pragmatism. They served their overlords, followed their programming, waged wars with mechanical efficiency. But for some, the horror of what they had become, the realization of what they had lost, drove them mad. These Necrons developed what came to be known as the Destroyer Curse, a pathological hatred of all life, a nihilistic drive to eliminate every organic being in the galaxy, as if by doing so they could somehow retroactively justify their own transformation. Destroyer Necrons are terrifying to behold. They modify their bodies, replacing limbs with advanced weapons, adding anti-gravitic drives that allow them to hover above the battlefield, transforming themselves into floating gun platforms that advance with implacable determination through any opposition. They do not take prisoners. They do not accept surrender. They simply kill everything organic they encounter, burning entire worlds clean of life before moving on to the next target. And at the pinnacle of this corruption stand the Destroyer Lords, Necrons, who have so fully embraced the curse that they can spread it to others, corrupting even previously stable Necrons through their mere presence. These lords are legends among their own kind, figures of terror who lead destroyer cults in crusades of extermination that can last for millennia. Nekrosor Ammentar is believed by many to be the first Destroyer Lord, the genesis of the curse itself. Some Necron scholars argue that Ammentar is mythological, a parable about guilt and betrayal that dates back to the shattering of the Citan at the end of the War in Heaven. Others insist that Ammentar is all too real, a figure who survived from the ancient days and whose madness has only deepened over the eons. What makes this mystery even stranger is that memories of Ammentar's true origins appear to have been forcibly removed from Necron records. Entire data vaults have been purged, all references to Ammentar's awakening and early campaigns deleted with a thoroughness that suggests deliberate suppression at the highest levels. And among the Necrons, there is only one being with the authority to order such a systematic erasure of history. The Silent King, Zarek, the last of the Triarchs who once ruled the entire Necron race. Why would the Silent King want Ammentar's origins hidden? What could be so terrible about this Destroyer Lord that even its own species seeks to forget it? These questions haunt those few Imperial scholars who study the Necrons, but answers remain elusive. All that is known for certain is that Ammentar exists, that it commands vast hordes of Destroyer Necrons whose corruption spreads like a plague, and that it has now set its sights on Ultramar. But Ammentar's ambitions extend beyond simple genocide. This ancient horror harbours an obsession that makes it even more dangerous. It seeks to reunite the scattered shards of the Nightbringer, the Citan god of death itself. The Citan were the star gods, beings of immense power who fed on stellar energy and the life force of entire species. The Necrons, realizing too late that they had been betrayed, eventually rose against their gods in a war that shattered the Citan into countless fragments. These shards were imprisoned in tesseract labyrinths or hidden across the galaxy, their power too dangerous to be allowed to fully manifest. But some shards have been found and controlled by Necron dynasties, wielded as weapons against their enemies, and the Nightbringer, perhaps the most terrifying of all the Citan, has shards scattered across dozens of tomb worlds. If those shards were to be gathered and reunited, even partially, the entity that resulted would be a force capable of killing entire worlds with a thought, a living embodiment of mortality itself. This is Ammentar's ultimate goal, to collect the Nightbringer's shards, to restore enough of the Star God's power to unleash it against the organic races infesting the galaxy, to watch as death itself sweeps across worlds, leaving nothing but ashes in its wake. And Ammentar believes that some of those shards are located in what is now the eastern sectors of Ultramar, buried in tomb worlds that the Imperium has settled and fortified, waiting to be reclaimed. The Necrons that follow Ammentar are not a conventional army. They are a plague, a corruption that spreads wherever they go. Standard Necron warriors marching in their phalanxes are bad enough, with their Geos weapons that strip atoms from matter, reducing armoured vehicles and flesh alike to particle streams. But Destroyer Necrons are worse. They advance on anti-gravitic platforms, their weapons upgraded to the most devastating configurations possible, their targeting protocols optimised for maximum killing efficiency. Scorpic destroyers move with terrifying speed, their hyperphase weapons phasing through armour to tear apart victims from within. Ophidian destroyers burrow through the ground, emerging in the midst of enemy formations to sow chaos and death. Lockhust, heavy destroyers hover above the battlefield, their heavy weaponry capable of annihilating tanks and fortifications with ease. Supporting these are plasmacytes, curious constructs that accelerate the destroyer corruption in nearby Necrons, pushing them further into the curse's embrace. Where plasmacytes float, even previously stable Necron warriors begin to exhibit signs of the madness, becoming more aggressive, more reckless, more focused on killing than on tactical objectives. It's a corruption that feeds on itself, growing stronger with each victory, each world scoured clean of life. And at the centre of this nightmare stands Ammentar itself, a figure of such power that other Necron dynasties actively avoid engaging with it, because Ammentar's very presence corrupts. Necron overlords who encounter the Destroyer Lord find their own programming beginning to degrade, their carefully maintained personalities giving way to the nihilistic urge to destroy. Even Necron nobles, who pride themselves on maintaining their ancient cultures and traditions, are not immune. Being near Ammentar is a kind of contagion, a mental virus that spreads through the quantum entanglement that links all Necrons to their dynasties. This makes Ammentar uniquely dangerous. A conventional enemy, no matter how powerful, can be surrounded and overwhelmed. But an enemy whose very presence corrupts your own forces, who can turn your allies against you simply by existing in the same battle space, presents challenges that no amount of firepower can solve. Fighting Ammentar means fighting not just the Destroyer Lord and its immediate forces, but also dealing with the corruption it spreads, the way it turns every engagement into a race to destroy it before your own forces begin to fall under its influence. The intelligence reports Titus studied painted a grim picture of Ammentar's campaign so far. The Destroyer Lord had awakened from its tomb world on the fringes of Ultramar and immediately launched a crusade of extermination. Worlds had been scoured clean, populations of billions reduced to nothing, Imperial forces overwhelmed by the relentless advance of destroyer hordes that seemed to care nothing for casualties or tactical disadvantages. Ammentar's forces simply advanced, absorbed losses that would have broken any organic army, and kept coming. What made it worse was the strategic intelligence behind the campaign. Despite the nihilistic madness of the Destroyer Curse, Ammentar was no mindless killer. It targeted specific worlds, struck at critical infrastructure, aimed to destabilize entire sectors, rather than simply killing everything it encountered. There was a plan behind the campaign, a terrible intelligence guiding the genocide. Imperial forces had tried to stop it, of course. Guard regiments had deployed, established defensive lines, called in artillery and air support. They had been swept aside like leaves before a storm. Space Marine strike forces had attempted surgical decapitations, trying to destroy Ammentar directly in hopes that removing the leader would break the invasion. They had been repelled, taking casualties that chapters could ill afford, and Ammentar had only grown stronger from the confrontation. And now, the intelligence suggested, Ammentar had identified the location of at least one Nightbringer shard within Ultramar's borders. Its forces were converging on the Vespator Front, the eastern sector where that shard was believed to be hidden in a tomb world that had been built over by an Imperial hive city. If Ammentar secured that shard, if it managed to awaken even a fraction of the Nightbringer's power, the death toll would be measured not in billions but in trillions. The Vespator Front had to hold, and that responsibility fell to Captain Titus and his Wardens of Ultramar. They would need to coordinate defences across dozens of worlds, manage the evacuation of civilians from threatened sectors, position military assets where they could do the most good, and somehow find a way to stop an enemy that was older than the Imperium, more numerous than they could easily count, and led by a being whose very existence was a weapon. It was an impossible mission. But then again, Titus had made a career out of accomplishing the impossible. From Graia to the Deathwatch to the Residius system, he had always found a way to triumph when the odds were stacked against him. The question was whether his luck would hold one more time, or if the Vespator Front would be where his story finally ended. There was only one way to find out: by going to war, by standing on the walls as the storm approached and refusing to yield, no matter the cost, by being the bulwark between civilization and annihilation, just as he had always been, just as he always would be until death finally claimed him. Captain Demetrian Titus, Master of the Watch, looked out at the hololithic displays showing the Vespator Front and the approaching Necron forces, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years, a strange kind of peace. This was where he belonged. This was what he was made for. All the trials, all the suffering, all the years of exile and service in the shadows had been preparation for this moment. He would defend Ultramar, he would stop Ammentar, he would protect the 500 worlds that Guilliman had worked so hard to restore, and if he died in the attempt, well, there were worse ways for a warrior to meet his end than standing in defence of everything he held dear. The war for the Vespator Front was about to begin, and Captain Titus was ready. The eastern sector of Ultramar, centred on the world of Vespator, had always been a region of strategic importance. Once part of the Southern League during the Great Crusade, it had been reorganised by Roboute Guilliman during the restoration of the 500 worlds, becoming one of the 4 tetrarchies that governed major sectors of the realm. It encompassed approximately 86 planets, ranging from bustling hive worlds to agricultural planets to vital forge worlds that produced the weapons and equipment that supplied Ultramar's military forces. The region was rich in resources, densely populated by Imperial standards and well defended with multiple naval stations, fortress worlds, and garrison forces drawn from both the Astra Militarum and the Ultramar Defence Auxilia. Under normal circumstances, the Vespator Front would be one of the safest regions in the entire Imperium, protected by the military might of the Ultramarines and their successor chapters, shielded by the vigilance of the Ultramar Defence Fleet, and administered by competent officials who understood the importance of maintaining strong defences. But these were not normal circumstances, and the enemy approaching Vespator was unlike anything the region had faced before. The campaign opened with precision strikes against communication nodes and astropathic relays. The Necrons, for all their advanced technology, understood the importance of isolating their targets, of preventing reinforcements from being called, or retreat routes from being established. Astropaths across the sector reported increasing difficulty maintaining contact with other worlds, their messages either failing to send or arriving so corrupted and delayed that they were useless for tactical coordination. This was the first sign that something was seriously wrong. The Necron advance created zones of psychic interference, dead spots in the warp, where astropathic communication simply failed. It was similar to the Tyrannid's shadow in the warp, but different, less like a blanket of psychic interference, and more like holes being punched in reality itself. Where the Necrons concentrated their forces, the warp seemed to recoil, creating regions where psychic powers didn't function properly, and where the very laws of physics seemed to bend in ways that made mortal minds ache to contemplate. Daniel Cornelius, the ancient astropath attached to Titus's command staff, worked tirelessly to maintain communication despite these obstacles. His power was such that he could force messages through even the most severe interference, though the effort cost him dearly. After each major transmission, he would need hours or even days to recover, his ancient body pushed to its limits by the psychic strain. But he persevered, ensuring that Titus received intelligence about enemy movements, and that his orders reached the forces that needed them. The first major engagement came on the hive world of Vethran Primus, an industrial planet whose manufactoria produced ammunition and power cells for the sector's military forces. Necron tomb ships emerged from the Dolmen Gates, the Necron's faster-than-light transportation system, appearing in orbit without warning. They deployed forces directly onto the planet's surface, bypassing the void defences that would have torn apart conventional invasion fleets. Fleet Commander Gaius Silva reacted immediately, redirecting naval assets to Vethran Primus and establishing a blockade to prevent more Necron forces from landing. But the damage was already done. Millions of Necron warriors and their destroyer escorts were already on the ground, advancing through the hive cities with mechanical efficiency, killing everything organic they encountered. Colonel Amelia Minervas coordinated the ground defence, pulling in guard regiments from nearby worlds and organising the local PDF forces into something resembling a coherent defensive line. But fighting Necrons in an urban environment was a nightmare. Gauss weaponry tore through reinforced bunkers, Wraith units phased through walls to attack from unexpected angles. Scarabs, those tiny flying robots that swarm in clouds of millions, descended on defensive positions and stripped flesh from bone in seconds. This was where Titus made his first critical decision. Rather than trying to hold every hive city, he would evacuate the civilian population and establish kill zones where the Necron's numerical advantage would be neutralized. Space Marine strike forces, supported by guard regiments, and the Ultramar Auxilia would conduct fighting retreats through prepared defensive positions, buying time for civilian evacuation while inflicting maximum casualties on the advancing Necrons. It was a brutal calculus, one that meant abandoning billions of credits worth of infrastructure and condemning entire hive sectors to destruction. But Titus understood that buildings could be rebuilt. Lost lives could not be replaced. The priority had to be preserving Ultramar's population, the people who made the 500 worlds worth defending in the first place. Ancient Gadriel led strike forces into the most contested zones. the Second Company's banner flying defiantly as they held choke points against overwhelming odds. The young ancient had come far from the suspicious warrior Titus had first met in the Residius system. He had grown into a true leader, inspiring the warriors around him through his courage and his unwavering faith in the chapter and its mission. Veteran Sergeant Matorus coordinated the withdrawal of civilians, his experience with logistics and organisation ensuring that evacuation routes remained open, even as Necron forces pressed the defenders from multiple directions. He worked closely with local officials, cutting through bureaucratic red tape with the authority of an Ultramarine, prioritising children and those too old or infirm to fight, making the hard decisions about who got on the evacuation transports and who had to stay behind to buy more time. The battle for Veteran Primus lasted 3 weeks. When it finally ended, when the last evacuation transport lifted off from the planet's surface and the remaining forces withdrew under covering fire from the defence fleet, over 90% of the civilian population had been saved. But the world itself was a ruin, its hive cities burned and broken, its manufactoria silent, its skies dark with the smoke of 1,000 fires, and Ammentar had barely noticed the resistance. The Destroyer Lord hadn't even appeared on Veteran Primus. It had been a probing attack, a test of Imperial defences conducted by subordinate overlords, while Ammentar focused on its true objective, identifying the location of the Nightbringer Shard. The intelligence breakthrough came from an unlikely source, captured Necron remains. When Necrons are destroyed in battle, they typically undergo a process called reanimation protocols, their bodies reforming or being teleported back to their tomb ships for repair. But sometimes, with enough damage dealt quickly enough, a Necron can be prevented from reanimating, leaving its inert form available for study. The Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests attached to Titus's forces examined these remains with eager fascination, probing the alien technology for any insights they could glean. What they discovered was disturbing. Encoded within the Necron systems were coordinates, targeting data for a specific location within the Vespator sector. And when those coordinates were plotted, they led directly to the tomb world of Solemnus Minor, a planet that had been colonized by the Imperium millennia ago and was now home to a hive city of over 3 billion souls. Ammentar was coming to Solemnus Minor. The Destroyer Lord believed the Nightbringer Shard was buried there, deep beneath the planet's surface in the tomb, complex that predated the Imperial settlement, and when it arrived it would not hesitate to kill every living being on the planet if that's what it took to claim the Shard. Titus made the decision immediately. Solemnus Minor would be the site of the decisive battle. He would concentrate every force available, establish defensive lines that the Necrons could not bypass, and hold the world no matter the cost. If Ammentar wanted the Nightbringer Shard, it would have to go through the Ultramarine Second Company and the Wardens of Ultramar to get it. The preparation was intense, exhausting, and conducted under conditions that would have broken lesser warriors. Titus coordinated with the other Space Marine chapters stationed in Ultramar, requesting strike forces from the Genesis chapter, the Nova Marines, and the Sons of Guilliman. He positioned void defences to make Necron reinforcement as difficult as possible. He established evacuation protocols for Solemnus Minor's population, though he knew that with over 3 billion people, full evacuation would be impossible before Ammentar arrived. Lucia Vesta, the diplomat on his staff, worked tirelessly to ensure cooperation from local officials who were, understandably, terrified at the prospect of their world becoming a major battleground. She secured promises of support from neighbouring systems, negotiated for additional supply shipments, and even managed to convince a rogue trader fleet to provide transport capacity for the evacuation in exchange for salvage rights on Necron technology after the battle. The defensive plan was built around concentric layers of resistance. The outer defence would be conducted in space, with the defence fleet engaging any Necron tomb ships that appeared in system. The goal was not to stop the Necrons from landing, but to thin their numbers and buy time for ground preparations. The middle layer would be planetary defence, orbital weapons, surface-to-orbit missile batteries, and fighter squadrons operating from airfields scattered across the planet. These would target Necron landing craft and attempt to funnel the invasion into predetermined kill zones. The inner defence would be where the real battle happened, on the ground, in the Hive City and the surrounding terrain, where Space Marines and Guard regiments would engage the Necron ground forces in brutal close-quarters combat. Titus positioned his forces carefully, establishing strong points that covered all approaches to the suspected location of the tomb entrance. Kill zones were prepared with overlapping fields of fire, pre-positioned explosives, and enough ammunition stockpiled to sustain prolonged combat. And at the very heart of the defence, in the deepest levels of the Hive City where preliminary excavation had revealed what appeared to be Necron structures, Titus positioned himself and his command squad. Because he understood something that many Imperial commanders failed to grasp when fighting Necrons. This wasn't just a battle of attrition. If Ammentar could be destroyed, if the Destroyer Lord could be permanently eliminated, the corruption it spread would end, and the Necron forces might actually break and withdraw. So the real mission wasn't just to hold the planet, it was to kill Nekrosor Ammentar, to confront the ancient evil that had terrorized the sector and destroy it so completely that not even Necron technology could bring it back. It was an audacious plan, perhaps even suicidal, but it was also the only way to truly win this war. 3 days before the predicted arrival of Ammentar's forces, Titus gathered his wardens and addressed them one final time before the battle. They stood in the command centre surrounded by hololithic displays showing the defensive positions, the estimated enemy strength, and the evacuation progress. Everyone understood the stakes. Everyone knew that many of them would not survive what was coming. "This is where we make our stand," Titus said, his voice calm despite the weight of the moment. "Not just for Solemnace Minor, not just for the Vespator Front, but for Ultramar itself. If Ammentar secures the Nightbringer Shard, if it manages to unleash even a fraction of that Citan's power, every world in this sector is doomed. We stop it here, or we don't stop it at all." He looked at each of his officers in turn. At Ancient Gadriel, young and eager, the standard bearer who would carry the Second Company's colours into the heart of the battle. At Mataurus, old and weathered, the veteran who had seen it all and still found the strength to keep fighting. At Fleet Commander Silver, whose ships would be the first line of defence. At Colonel Minerva's, whose auxilia would bear the brunt of the ground combat. At Vesta, who had ensured that they had the support they needed. And at Cornelius, the ancient astropath whose power kept them connected across the chaos of war. "I won't lie to you," Titus continued. "This will be the hardest fight any of us have faced. The Necrons are older than the Imperium. Their technology is beyond our understanding, and they do not break, do not retreat, do not fear. They will keep coming until they are destroyed or until we are. There is no middle ground here." He paused, letting that truth settle over them all. Then he smiled, a fierce, predatory expression that reminded everyone why he had earned the rank of captain. "But we are Ultramarines. We are the sons of Guilliman, the defenders of the 500 worlds, the warriors who have never ever given up no matter the odds. We have faced the Tyranids and survived. We have battled chaos and remained pure. We have stood against every enemy the galaxy has thrown at us for 10,000 years, and we will stand now." He activated the final display showing the planet below, the Hive City that would soon become a battlefield, and the icon representing Ammentar's approaching forces. "For Ultramar, for the Emperor, for humanity. We will hold this world, we will destroy Ammentar, and we will prove once again that there is no threat we cannot overcome. Courage and honour." The response was immediate, thunderous. Courage and honour. And then, because there was nothing more to say and the time for preparation had passed, they dispersed to their positions. Gadriel to the Second Company, who would form the spearhead of the defence. Mataurus to the veteran squads who would anchor the defensive lines. Silver to his flagship in orbit. Minerva's to the Guard regiments spread across the planet. Vesta to ensure that the last evacuations proceeded smoothly. Cornelius to his sanctum, preparing himself for the psychic strain of maintaining communications throughout the coming battle. And Titus himself went to the deepest level, to the place where Necron structures had been revealed beneath the Imperial Hive City, where he suspected the tomb entrance lay. He would face Ammentar there, when the Destroyer Lord came to claim its prize, one ancient warrior against another, both shaped by ages of war, both utterly committed to their cause, both willing to die, if that's what victory demanded. The stage was set, the defenders were in position, the evacuation was as complete as it could be, and in the darkness of space, tomb ships emerged from the dolmen gates, carrying Nekrosor Ammentar and its legion of corrupted Necrons towards Solemnus Minor. The battle for Ultramar's soul was about to begin. There's something fundamental about the concept of the last stand that resonates through all of human history, from ancient Thermopylae to the walls of terror during the siege that nearly ended the Imperium. It's the moment when retreat is no longer possible, when compromise would mean annihilation, when the only choice left is to stand and fight, even though the outcome seems predetermined. It's the moment that defines what it means to be human, what it means to have something worth dying for. For Captain Demetrian Titus, standing on Solomones Minor as Ammentar's forces descended, this was his last stand in more ways than one. Not necessarily in the sense that he expected to die, though he was prepared for that possibility, but in the sense that this was the culmination of everything his long career had been building toward, the moment where all his skills, all his experience, all his hard-won wisdom would be tested against an enemy that represented the very antithesis of everything he fought to protect. The Necrons, and particularly the Destroyers under Ammentar's command, embodied a philosophy of absolute negation. They looked at the galaxy teeming with life and saw it as an affront, a corruption of what they believed should be the natural state of the universe, cold, sterile perfection unmarred by the chaos of organic existence. In their view, they were not conquerors or even killers. They were cleaners, restoring the galaxy to what it should be. Against this philosophy of death stood Titus and everything he represented, the belief that life, for all its messiness and imperfection, was worth preserving. That humanity, despite its myriad flaws, deserved to continue. That the Imperium, for all its cruelty and corruption, was still better than the alternatives. That there were things worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth standing against impossible odds to defend. It's easy to be cynical about the Imperium of man. It's easy to look at its xenophobia, its religious fanaticism, its casual brutality toward its own citizens, and conclude that perhaps it doesn't deserve to survive. But Titus had seen what the alternatives were. He had fought chaos, which offered only madness and eternal damnation. He had battled orcs, who lived only for violence and would turn the galaxy into an eternal battlefield. He had faced tyrannids, who would consume every last spark of life and leave behind dead worlds stripped of even basic biomass. And now he faced Necrons who wanted to exterminate all organic life on principle. For all its flaws, the Imperium at least offered humans a chance to live, to love, to build something that might outlast their brief lives. That was worth defending, worth dying for if necessary. And Titus understood better than most what that defence truly meant. He had been wrongly accused, cast out, forced to serve in exile for decades because of suspicions that had no basis in reality. He had every reason to be bitter, to question whether the Imperium deserved his loyalty. But he had never wavered, never doubted his purpose, because he understood something that Leandros and so many others failed to grasp. You don't serve institutions because they're perfect. You serve them because the alternative is worse. You stand not because victory is certain, but because surrender means the death of everything you hold dear. That's the philosophy of the last stand. Knowing that you might fail, that the odds are against you, that history might not remember your sacrifice, and standing anyway because it's the right thing to do. as Titus watched the first Necron landing craft breach the atmosphere, as he heard the reports of tomb ships engaging the defence fleet in orbit, as he felt the weight of millions of lives depending on the defence he had organised, he thought about all the warriors who had stood where he stood now, the ancient Greeks at Thermopylae, the defenders of Terra during the siege, Captain Trajan, facing his death on Beta Arcturus to save a captured marine. All of them had understood that some battles have to be fought even when the outcome is uncertain, because the alternative is unacceptable. But Titus also understood something that distinguishes a good commander from a merely brave one. Martyrdom is not the same as victory. Standing and dying heroically might inspire future generations, but what the Imperium needed right now wasn't inspiration. It needed Solomus Minor held. It needed Ammentar destroyed. It needed the Vespator Front secured so that the 500 worlds could continue their restoration. So while Titus was prepared to die if that's what the mission required, he was not seeking death. He was seeking victory. And that meant using every advantage he had, every lesson learned in over 2 centuries of warfare, every skill honed through trials that would have broken lesser warriors. He thought about Guilliman's teachings, the wisdom encoded in the Codex Astartes, but also the spirit behind those teachings. Adapt, innovate, think 3 moves ahead of your opponent. The Necrons had technology that seemed like magic. Fine. Humanity had courage, adaptability, and the willingness to sacrifice that the cold logic of mechanical warriors couldn't match. The Necrons had Ammentar, whose very presence corrupted. Fine. Titus would find a way to turn that corruption against the Destroyer Lord, to use its own strength as a weakness. As the battle began in earnest, as the first wave of Necron warriors advanced through the kill zones and into the prepared defensive positions, Titus made his way deeper into the structure beneath the Hive City, following tunnels that grew older and stranger the further he descended. The architecture changed from Imperial Gothic to something far more ancient. Walls that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Corridors that bent at angles that made mortal eyes water to contemplate. He was not alone. His command squad accompanied him, veterans of the Second Company, warriors who had proven themselves across countless battlefields. And behind them came a force of Terminators, elite warriors in tactical dreadnought armour, whose resilience and firepower would be essential when they finally confronted Ammentar. Above them, the battle raged. Ancient Gadriel held the Second Company's lines against wave after wave of Necron assault. Mataurus coordinated reinforcements, plugging gaps in the defence before they could become breaches. Fleet Commander Silver fought a running battle in orbit, his ships dancing through clouds of Necron interceptors to strike at the tomb ships deploying more forces. Colonel Minerva's rallied her guard regiments when panic threatened to break their lines, her voice cutting through the chaos to remind them what they were fighting for. And deep beneath it all, Titus advanced toward his rendezvous with Destiny, toward the confrontation that would determine the fate of the Vespator Front, and perhaps Ultramar itself. There's a quote, ancient even by the standards of the 41st millennium, that has been repeated so often it's become almost cliché. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. But clichés become clichés because they contain fundamental truths, and in the grim darkness of the far future, where evil comes in 1,000 forms and good is often hard to define, the truth remains. Someone has to stand. Someone has to fight. Someone has to be willing to sacrifice. Everything to ensure that the light, however dim, continues to burn. Demetrian Titus had always been that someone. From the moment Mataurus had found a fearless boy on Tarentus, through his rise to captain, his fall into disgrace, his long years of exile, his redemption and return, he had been the warrior who stood when others fell, who fought when others surrendered, who never gave up even when hope seemed lost. And now, descending into the ancient darkness beneath Solemnus Minor, about to face an enemy older than his entire species, leading warriors who trusted him to bring them through impossible odds, Captain Titus embodied the philosophy of the Last Stand. Not the fatalistic acceptance of death, but the determined refusal to yield, the commitment to stand and fight for as long as breath remained, and the hope, however slim, that courage and skill might triumph over mere power and numbers. The defence of the Vespator Front continues even as you listen to this. The war for Ultramar's soul is not a single battle, but a campaign that will span months or years, countless engagements fought across dozens of worlds, each one critical to the overall defence of the 500 worlds. And at the centre of it all stands Captain Demetrian Titus, the warrior who has been tested in every way a man can be tested and emerged stronger for it. But Titus's story is more than just the tale of one warrior. It's a reflection of the larger struggle facing humanity in the Era Indomitus, the age when the Imperium of man faces existential threats from every direction and must somehow find the strength to endure. It's a story about redemption, about the possibility of rising from disgrace and proving your worth through deeds rather than words. It's a story about loyalty, about standing by your principles even when doing so cost you everything. And most importantly, it's a story about hope, because in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and suffering seems endless, hope is the most powerful weapon humanity possesses. Not the naive hope that everything will work out fine, but the grim determination that even if we fall, even if we lose, we will fight until our last breath to ensure that something, anything, survives to carry on. The 500 Worlds expansion that Games Workshop has announced will continue Titus's story, giving us new insights into his character, new challenges for him to overcome, and new reasons to believe that even in the darkest timeline, there are heroes worth celebrating. The campaign system detailed in the War on the Vespator Front book will let players experience firsthand the kind of desperate defensive battles that Titus and his wardens are fighting, where every territory captured or lost matters, where every engagement feeds into the larger strategic picture. The miniatures being released showing Titus in his new role as Master of the Watch, surrounded by the Wardens of Ultramar, are more than just game pieces. They're representations of characters who have earned their place in the lore through trials and sacrifice, who embody the best qualities of what the Imperium claims to be even when it falls short of those ideals. And the enemy facing them, Nekrosor Ammentar and its corrupted legions, represents a threat worthy of these heroes, an ancient evil that cannot be negotiated with or compromised with, but must be utterly destroyed if Ultramar is to survive. This is what Warhammer 40,000 does best, taking the most epic scale imaginable, galaxy-spanning conflicts involving forces beyond human comprehension, and grounding them in personal stories about individuals who make choices that matter. Captain Titus's defense of Ultramar matters not just because of the strategic implications, but because we've followed his journey, seen him rise and fall and rise again, and come to care about whether he succeeds or fails. The Era Indomitus is a time of unprecedented danger for the Imperium, but it's also a time of unprecedented heroism. Roboute Guilliman has returned to lead humanity's defence, bringing with him new technologies, new strategies, and new hope. The Primaris Space Marines represent a new generation of warriors, stronger and more resilient than their firstborn predecessors, and veterans like Titus bridge the gap between old and new, bringing centuries of experience to bear alongside enhanced capabilities. But none of that guarantees victory. The threats are real, the dangers genuine, the possibility of failure ever present. That's what makes these stories compelling. We don't know if Titus will successfully defend the Vespator Front. We don't know if Ammentar can be permanently destroyed or if the Destroyer Lord will escape to threaten Ultramar another day. We don't know if the Nightbringer Shard will be secured or if its terrible power will be unleashed. What we do know is that Titus will fight with everything he has, that his wardens will stand beside him, each bringing unique skills and perspectives to the defence, that the Ultramarine Second Company will uphold the traditions and honour of their chapter, that the mortal soldiers of the Ultramar Defence Auxilia will prove that courage isn't the exclusive province of superhuman warriors, that Fleet Commander Silver's ships will hold the void against overwhelming odds, and that somewhere, watching it all, Primarch Roboute Guilliman will see his trust validated or his hopes dashed depending on how this campaign unfolds. This is what the 500 Worlds campaign represents, the defence not just of territory, but of the idea that humanity deserves to survive, that civilization is worth preserving, that the light can endure even in the darkest night if enough brave souls are willing to stand and fight for it. Captain Titus's last stand on the Vespator Front is that fight writ large, a single warrior and his allies standing as the bulwark between Ultramar and annihilation. So as we close this exploration of Titus's story, of the 500 worlds and their significance, of the threats facing Ultramar and the heroes rising to meet those threats, remember this: in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But there are also warriors like Demetrian Titus, who fight not because victory is certain, but because some things are worth fighting for even when the odds seem impossible. And as long as such warriors continue to stand, as long as humans are willing to sacrifice everything in defence of their fellows, there is hope. Hope that tomorrow will come. Hope that the Imperium will endure. Hope that somewhere, somehow, humanity will find a way to survive another day, another year, another century in a galaxy that wants nothing more than to grind us into dust. That hope is what Captain Titus defends on the Vespator Front. That hope is what the Ultramarines stand for. That hope is what makes the 500 worlds worth fighting for. And that hope is what will sustain them through whatever trials lie ahead. For Ultramar, for the Emperor, for humanity, courage and honour. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the lore of Captain Titus and the defence of the 500 worlds, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Obsidian Scriptorium for more Warhammer 40k content. We'll be following the Vespator Front campaign as it develops, bringing you analysis, speculation, and all the juicy lore details you need to understand what's happening in the darkest corner of the darkest future. Thanks for watching, and remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, but there are also heroes worth celebrating. Captain Titus is one of them, and his story is far from over. The Emperor protects.